good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. What becomes of the world when its rightful ruler is destroyed, the law is broken, and the future must grow in secret while chaos sits openly on the throne? For the people of ancient Egypt, Horus was not just a figure carved into temple walls or painted on sacred papyrus. He was protection in times of danger, strength in moments of uncertainty, and the living symbol of rightful kingship. Children grew up hearing his story, rulers carried his image as a promise of power, and entire cities prayed for his watchful gaze to stay upon them. His tale is filled with struggle, inheritance, betrayal, resilience, and the unshakable belief that order could triumph over chaos. Tonight, we step quietly into that world. We follow the story of Horus, not as a distant legend, but as a presence that shaped a civilization, guided its rulers, and offered comfort to countless hearts beneath the golden Egyptian sun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you'd like, share where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins at a moment when the ancient Egyptian universe no longer feels secure. In the Egyptian understanding of existence, the world did not run automatically. It depended on balance, order, and rightful rule, what they called Maat. When Maat held firm, the Nile flooded as expected, justice could be trusted, and life unfolded with a reassuring rhythm. When Maat failed, nothing else could be relied upon. That failure came with the murder of Osiris. Osiris was not simply a king among gods. He embodied lawful kingship itself, the idea that rule should nurture, preserve, and bind the living and the dead into a single, stable system. When his brother Seth killed him and seized power, Egypt's cosmic order fractured. This was not viewed as a temporary disturbance, but as a dangerous rupture that threatened everything from harvests to moral judgment. In the aftermath, there was no immediate restoration. Seth ruled openly, asserting strength and dominance rather than legitimacy. He represented forces Egypt feared but also acknowledged: desert winds, storms, foreign lands, disruption. These forces had their place, but never at the center. Now they occupied the throne, and the question of succession remained unresolved. It was during this uncertainty that Horus was born. His arrival was not announced. There were no celebrations, no witnesses beyond his mother. Isis understood immediately that survival required silence. As the widow of Osiris and mother of the rightful heir, she was vulnerable. The child himself was a living threat to Seth's claim. Isis withdrew from the visible world and hid among the marshlands of the Nile Delta, where reeds, water, and shifting ground offered concealment. These marshes were not peaceful havens. They were unstable environments filled with disease, insects, and danger. Yet they lay beyond the reach of centralized power. There, Isis raised Horus away from temples and courts, shaping him through protection rather than privilege. The child's early life was marked by caution, ritual care, and constant vigilance. Egyptian myth tells of Horus falling ill many times during childhood, struck by poison, fever, or unseen forces. These moments mattered deeply. Illness was never random in Egyptian thought. It was a sign that balance had been disturbed. Each time Isis healed her son through spells, prayers, and divine intervention, the act carried meaning. Restoration was not only physical, it rehearsed the repair of the world itself. Horus grew up knowing loss before he knew authority. He learned of his father not through memory, but through instruction. Osiris was described not as a conqueror, but as a just ruler who taught humanity, agriculture, law, and continuity. Horus's inheritance, therefore, was not vengeance, it was responsibility. As he matured, the unresolved problem of kingship could no longer be ignored. Egypt, even in myth, resisted arbitrary power. Rule required legitimacy, and legitimacy required recognition. The gods convened to judge between Horus and Seth. What followed was not a swift decision, but prolonged debate, reflecting a deep discomfort with disorder left unaddressed. Seth argued from strength and experience. He had ruled, maintained borders, and embodied raw power. Horus argued from lineage and continuity. He was the son of Osiris, born into rightful succession. The gods were divided. Some feared Seth's violence, but relied on his force. Others trusted Horus's claim, but doubted his readiness. This hesitation mattered. Egyptian culture valued process as much as outcome. Authority gained too quickly, without recognition, was suspect. Horus was tested not only through confrontation but through endurance. He waited. He submitted to judgment. He absorbed delay without abandoning his claim. The conflict did eventually turn violent, but even then it unfolded within rules. Challenges were issued. Contests were staged. Injuries occurred, most famously the loss of Horus's eye, a wound that became central to Egyptian symbolism. When the eye was later restored, it came to represent healing, completeness, and measured balance rather than invulnerability. Throughout this long struggle, Osiris exerted influence from the realm of the dead. His authority had not ended with his murder. It had shifted. This reinforced a crucial Egyptian belief. Death did not dissolve responsibility. The dead remained active participants in cosmic order. When resolution finally came, it did not arrive as a dramatic overthrow. Horus did not destroy Seth. Instead, the gods confirmed Horus as rightful ruler because he embodied continuity, patience, and lawful succession. Seth was not erased but reassigned, maintaining necessary chaos at the edges of the world without dominating its center. With Horus's recognition, balance returned, kingship was restored, rituals regained coherence. The universe settled back into rhythm. From that moment onward, Horus became inseparable from human rule. Every pharaoh was considered Horus in life, the living guarantor of order, and Osiris in death, ruler of the afterlife. Kingship itself became a sacred process linking myth, governance, and daily existence. Horus was not remembered as a reckless hero. He was defined by restraint, recovery, and lawful persistence. His strength lay in restoration rather than conquest, in patience rather than spectacle. As the world grows quieter and attention softens, the story of Horus offers a calm but steady lesson preserved for thousands of years. That order is not born from force alone, that legitimacy matters, and that the future often survives quietly, hidden, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. After Horus's birth and the fragile preservation of his early life, the world around him did not suddenly steady itself. Egypt, in mythic memory, remained suspended in a prolonged state of uncertainty. Seth still occupied the visible seat of power, and the gods had not yet resolved the matter of succession. This lingering instability shaped every aspect of Horus's childhood. He did not grow toward a clear future. Instead, he grew within a pause, a long, uneasy holding of breath in the fabric of the cosmos. The marshlands where Horus was raised were not chosen for comfort, but for their ambiguity. They existed between solid ground and open water, neither fully cultivated nor fully wild. In Egyptian thought, such liminal spaces were powerful but dangerous. They were places where transformation occurred, where boundaries softened. For Isis, this made them ideal for concealment. For Horus, they became his first classroom. Isis did not raise her son as a warrior in training. She raised him as a survivor shaped by knowledge. Each day was structured around observation and restraint. The reeds provided cover, but they also whispered with movement. Every sound mattered. The river brought food and transport, but also disease and threat. Horus learned to read his environment, not as scenery, but as a system of signs. Illness was a recurring presence. Ancient Egyptian texts describe Horus being struck by poison, fever, and sudden weakness. These episodes were not presented as isolated events. They were understood as manifestations of imbalance, reflections of a world still misaligned after Osiris's murder. When Horus suffered, it was not only his body at risk, but the future of order itself. Isis responded with ritual precision. Healing in Egyptian culture was never purely medicinal. It involved spoken words, gestures, amulets, and appeals to divine authority. Isis invoked older gods, local spirits, and cosmic principles. She spoke names carefully, because naming was a form of control. Through these acts, Horus absorbed a lesson central to Egyptian worldview. Power was not always visible, and strength often worked quietly. These healing moments also reinforced Horus's dependence on community beyond himself. He was not portrayed as invulnerable or self-sufficient. Instead, his survival depended on networks of care, divine cooperation, and inherited knowledge. This stood in contrast to Seth's emphasis on dominance and force. From the beginning, Horus embodied a different model of authority, one rooted in interdependence. As Horus grew older, Isis began to teach him about his father. Osiris was not described to Horus as a tragic victim, but as a completed ruler. His reign was remembered as stable and instructive. He brought agriculture, law, and moral order. He unified land and people through continuity rather than fear. In these stories, Horus learned that kingship was not a reward, but a responsibility carried forward across generations. The absence of Osiris mattered as much as his presence. Horus never knew his father in life. This created a form of inherited memory rather than personal attachment. His identity was shaped by obligation rather than nostalgia. He did not seek to restore Osiris as he once was, but to resume the order Osiris represented. Beyond Isis, other deities contributed to Horus's upbringing. Protective gods and goddesses intervened at critical moments, reinforcing the idea that Horus was not alone, but also not yet ready to stand publicly. Each intervention delayed his emergence while strengthening his foundation. Egyptian myth valued preparation over haste. A future ruler who emerged too early risked repeating the very imbalance he was meant to correct. Meanwhile, Seth's rule continued to cast a long shadow. Seth was not depicted as an incompetent ruler. He was effective in maintaining borders and confronting external threats, but his reign lacked legitimacy. It was grounded in force rather than lineage, in assertion rather than consent. This distinction mattered deeply in Egyptian political thought. The gods themselves were divided in their assessment. Some respected Seth's strength and necessity. Others feared the precedent his rule established. This division created prolonged indecision, which Egyptian culture found deeply unsettling. Order depended not only on power, but on clarity. Ambiguity was corrosive. Horus became aware of this tension gradually. He was not raised with the expectation of immediate confrontation. Instead, Isis emphasized patience. She taught him restraint, reminding him that timing mattered as much as action. To act too soon would be to invite destruction not only of himself, but of the future he represented. As Horus approached maturity, his body strengthened, but his role remained undefined. He was not yet acknowledged as heir, nor dismissed as irrelevant. He existed in a suspended state that mirrored Egypt's unresolved condition. This prolonged adolescence was not portrayed as weakness, it was presented as necessary incubation. During this period, Horus began to practice rituals associated with kingship, not publicly, but symbolically. These acts were rehearsals rather than declarations. They aligned him with cosmic order without provoking open conflict. In Egyptian myth, rehearsal carried real weight. It prepared reality to accept what was coming. The marshes continued to shape Horus's character. They taught adaptability. Water levels changed daily, paths disappeared, shelter was temporary. This environment trained Horus to respond rather than dominate. It reinforced attentiveness over aggression. These qualities would later distinguish him sharply from Seth. Eventually, the matter of succession could no longer remain unresolved. The gods convened to hear claims. This moment did not mark a sudden shift, but a slow transition from concealment to visibility. Horus did not emerge as a conqueror demanding recognition. He appeared as a claimant presenting continuity. The hearings before the Divine Council were lengthy. They reflected Egyptian discomfort with abrupt resolution. Both Horus and Seth presented their cases repeatedly. Seth emphasized experience, asserting that rule belonged to the strongest. Horus emphasized lineage, arguing that kingship was inherited, not seized. The gods hesitated. Their hesitation was not indecision, but caution. Egyptian culture understood that once a ruler was affirmed, the choice could not be easily undone. Kingship shaped reality itself. A wrong decision risked prolonged disorder. During this period, Horus faced trials designed to test his suitability. These trials did not focus solely on combat. They examined endurance, judgment, and restraint. Horus's willingness to submit to process mattered as much as any display of strength. He did not reject the authority of the council, even when outcomes were delayed. Conflict between Horus and Seth did eventually become physical, but it followed rules. Challenges were formal, injuries were significant but symbolic. The most enduring of these was the injury to Horus's eye. This loss was not portrayed as failure, it represented imbalance, a temporary fragmentation of wholeness. The restoration of the eye was equally significant. It was not instantaneous. Healing required intervention, time, and cooperation among gods. When the eye was restored, it became a symbol of completeness, regained through care rather than force. The Eye of Horus came to represent protection, health, and measured integrity. Throughout these trials, Isis continued to guide Horus quietly. She did not intervene to win the conflict outright. Instead, she ensured that Horus remained aligned with rightful process. Her role reinforced the Egyptian belief that wisdom often worked behind the scenes. Osiris, ruling from the realm of the dead, began to exert influence as well. His authority had not ended with death. In Egyptian thought, the dead retained agency and responsibility. Osiris's presence reminded the gods that kingship extended beyond life, binding generations together. The eventual decision in favor of Horus did not come as a dramatic climax. It unfolded through accumulation of endurance, legitimacy, and restored balance. Horus was affirmed as rightful ruler not because he destroyed Seth, but because he embodied continuity. Seth was not eliminated. Instead, his role was redefined. He remained necessary at the edges of the world, containing chaos rather than ruling it. This resolution reflected Egyptian pragmatism. Chaos could not be erased, only managed. With Horus's recognition, order returned gradually. Rituals regained coherence. Authority regained clarity. The cosmos settled into rhythm once more. Horus's early years, shaped by hiding, illness, patience, and instruction, became foundational to his identity. He was not remembered as a reckless victor, but as a restorer. His strength lay in alignment rather than domination. As the story moves forward, Horus will no longer remain concealed. He will become inseparable from kingship itself, embodied in every pharaoh who rules in his name. But that future rests firmly on these quiet years, years defined not by spectacle, but by preparation. The shadow of Osiris's murder. The absence of Osiris was never distant. It was not a past event that faded as Horus grew older, but a continuing condition that shaped the structure of the world around him. In Egyptian myth, murder, especially the murder of a rightful king, did not end when the act was completed. It lingered, altering relationships, distorting authority, and unsettling time itself. Osiris's death remained active, unresolved, and deeply consequential. Osiris had not been merely another god among many. He represented the ideal of kingship as continuity. His reign symbolized the joining of land, people, and moral order into a single, functioning whole. Agriculture followed predictable rhythms. Justice had a clear source. Life and death were connected through ritual rather than fear. When Osiris was killed by his brother Seth, that entire structure collapsed inward. For Horus, this loss was inherited rather than remembered. He did not experience grief in the personal sense, he experienced consequence. From an early age, he was taught that the world he inhabited was incomplete because something essential had been removed. Osiris's murder was not framed as tragedy alone, but as a rupture that demanded repair. Isis spoke of Osiris carefully. She did not dwell on the violence of his death, nor did she soften its meaning. She presented his life as a model, and his absence as a responsibility. Horus learned that his father's authority had not vanished, only changed form. Osiris now ruled the Duat, the realm of the dead, overseeing judgment and renewal beyond the visible world. This reframing mattered. It meant that death did not dissolve kingship, it transformed it. This belief shaped Horus's understanding of time. Egyptian culture did not separate past, present, and future sharply. They flowed into one another. Osiris existed simultaneously as memory, authority, and ongoing presence. Horus's task was not to reverse the past, but but to complete what had been interrupted. The manner of Osiris's death intensified its significance. Seth did not challenge him openly or defeat him in battle. He deceived him, violated trust, and used concealment to seize power. This act mattered deeply in Egyptian moral thought. Kingship gained through deception was fundamentally unstable. It lacked Ma'at, the principle of balance and truth that sustained the cosmos. Seth's crime, therefore, placed him outside the proper flow of order, even as he occupied the throne. This contradiction-visible rule without legitimacy created a tension that could not resolve itself naturally. It required intervention, judgment, and acknowledgement. As Horus matured, he began to understand that his claim was not simply personal, it was structural. The universe required a ruler whose authority aligned with cosmic principles. Without that alignment, no amount of strength could stabilize the world. The gods themselves struggled with this reality. Seth was powerful and necessary. He embodied storm, disruption, and the force required to defend borders. Egypt did not imagine a world without chaos. It imagined a world where chaos was contained. Seth's crime was not that he represented disorder, but that he placed disorder at the center. Osiris's murder forced the gods to confront the limits of force-based authority. They could not ignore Seth's strength, but neither could they endorse his rule without undermining the very principles that made divine governance meaningful. For Horus, this created a difficult inheritance. His claim rested on lineage, but lineage alone was insufficient. He needed recognition. Recognition required process. Egyptian myth emphasizes this repeatedly. Authority imposed without consent, even divine consent, remained suspect. The long delay between Osiris's death and Horus's eventual recognition was therefore not a narrative accident. It reflected Egyptian discomfort with abrupt restoration. Balance restored too quickly risked appearing artificial. Order needed to be rebuilt gradually through acknowledgement of loss. Osiris's continued role in the Duat reinforced this process. From the realm of the dead, he observed the dispute, advised the gods, and reminded them that kingship extended beyond life. His presence prevented the conflict from becoming purely about power. It reframed it as a matter of continuity across generations. This belief deeply influenced Egyptian funerary practices and political ideology. Pharaohs were not only rulers of the living, they were future Osirises, destined to maintain order after death. Horus's identity was inseparable from this cycle. He was not only heir to Osiris's throne, but participant in a system that linked life, death, and governance into a single rhythm. The shadow of Osiris's murder also shaped Horus's emotional restraint. Unlike many heroic figures, Horus was not driven by rage. Egyptian culture did not idealize uncontrolled emotion, especially in rulers. A king ruled through steadiness, not impulse. Horus's measured response to his father's death demonstrated his suitability for rule. This restraint did not mean passivity. Horus pursued his claim persistently. He appeared before the divine council. He endured delay. He accepted trials. Each act reinforced his legitimacy. He was not attempting to seize power, but to restore it. The gods tested him accordingly. They observed not only his strength, but his patience. They watched how he responded to provocation. Seth sought to provoke rash action, knowing that impulsiveness would undermine Horus's claim. Horus resisted. This resistance mattered more than victory in any single contest. The injury Horus later suffered, the loss of his eye, must be understood in this context. It was not simply a wound inflicted by Seth. It symbolized the incomplete state of the world, while Osiris's murder remained unresolved. A damaged eye represented distorted perception, imbalance, and partial order. The restoration of the eye carried equal significance. It did not erase the injury, it acknowledged it and healed it through collective effort. This process mirrored what Horus sought to achieve politically, not denial of loss, but restoration through recognition. Osiris's murder also influenced how Egyptians understood justice. Justice was not immediate retaliation, it was alignment. A wrong disrupted order, justice restored it. Horus's approach embodied this principle. He did not seek to punish Seth out of anger, he sought to reposition him within a balanced system. This distinction explains why Seth was not destroyed at the conflict's conclusion. Egyptian myth resisted absolute annihilation. Chaos eliminated entirely would leave the world brittle and undefended. Chaos contained, assigned, and bounded could serve a purpose. The resolution of Osiris's murder therefore required more than replacing Seth with Horus. It required redefining the structure of power itself. Horus ruled the center. Seth guarded the margins. Osiris governed the afterlife. Each occupied a defined role. For Horus, stepping into kingship meant accepting this complexity. He did not inherit a simple throne. He inherited a repaired system built on acknowledgement of loss, endurance of conflict, and restoration of balance. This inheritance shaped his enduring symbolism. Horus was not remembered as the avenger of Osiris, but as the continuer of his work. His falcon form, with its steady gaze and broad vision, reflected oversight rather than aggression. As the narrative moves forward, the consequences of Osiris's murder will continue to echo. They will shape divine politics, human kingship, and religious practice for centuries. But the foundation has been laid here, in the quiet understanding that order cannot simply be reclaimed, it must be rebuilt. The shadow of Osiris's death does not fade, it stabilizes. It becomes part of the structure Horus governs. In this way, loss itself is integrated into continuity, and the world moves forward not by forgetting what was broken, but by carrying it carefully into what comes next. Egypt's divine politics emerge. With the shadow of Osiris's murder fully acknowledged, the conflict surrounding Horus entered a new phase, one less concerned with survival or inheritance alone, and more deeply entangled with governance itself. What unfolded was not a simple contest between two rivals, but a prolonged exposure of how authority was understood in the Egyptian mind. The struggle revealed that even among gods, power was not absolute. It was constrained, debated, and subject to order. Egyptian mythology did not imagine its gods as impulsive or chaotic assemblies. They operated within structure. The divine world mirrored the human one, only more enduring. Councils formed. Precedents mattered. Decisions carried consequences that rippled across land, people, and time. This was especially true when the matter at hand was kingship, the central pillar holding the cosmos upright. As Horus stepped closer to public recognition, the gods were forced to confront a difficult truth. There was no automatic solution to the problem of succession. Osiris had ruled lawfully, Seth ruled forcefully. Horus represented continuity, but continuity alone did not resolve the practical question of governance. The gods needed to determine not just who should rule, but how such decisions were made. This was the beginning of divine politics in its clearest form. The Council of Gods, often described as the Eniad, was not a ceremonial gathering. It was a deliberative body, reflecting Egypt's deep belief in structured authority. These gods did not rush judgment. They weighed arguments, revisited decisions, and tolerated long periods of uncertainty rather than risk destabilizing the universe through haste. Seth presented himself as an effective ruler. He argued that strength ensured stability, that borders were defended, and that threats were confronted directly. In a world that acknowledged constant danger, from desert encroachment to foreign invasion, this argument carried weight. Egypt valued protection. Seth embodied it. Horus's claim was different. He did not deny Seth's strength. Instead, he emphasized legitimacy. Kingship, he argued, was not a prize to be seized, but an office inherited through rightful lineage. To ignore that principle would be to unravel the very idea of order. If rule could be taken through violence alone, then no succession would ever be secure. The gods found themselves divided not by loyalty, but by philosophy. Some feared that removing Seth would weaken the cosmic defenses. Others feared that endorsing him would undermine the foundations of Maat. This tension did not resolve easily, because both sides touched on genuine Egyptian concerns. Egyptian culture was deeply conservative in the literal sense. It sought to conserve balance. Innovation was approached cautiously. Abrupt change risked chaos. The gods' hesitation reflected this worldview. A decision about kingship could not be reversed lightly. Once made, it would define the structure of reality. During this period, Horus learned something crucial. Authority required patience. He was not granted immediate victory, nor was he dismissed. He remained in contention, his claim neither confirmed nor denied. This prolonged uncertainty tested his restraint more than any physical trial could have. Seth attempted to exploit this delay. He provoked Horus, challenged his readiness, and sought to frame patience as weakness. But Horus did not withdraw. He continued to present himself before the council, reaffirming his claim without escalation. This consistency mattered. It demonstrated stability, an essential quality in Egyptian leadership. The gods observed closely. They were not only judging claims, they were studying character. Egyptian kingship demanded emotional control. A ruler who acted impulsively endangered Ma'at. Horus's restraint, learned during years of hiding and preparation, now served him directly. Isis continued to influence events subtly. She did not dominate the council, nor did she override its authority. Instead, she ensured that Horus's claim was articulated clearly and persistently. Her role illustrated another Egyptian principle. Power exercised indirectly could be more effective than power imposed openly. As deliberations dragged on, the gods introduced formal trials. These were not arbitrary tests of strength, but structured challenges designed to reveal suitability. Combat occurred, but it followed rules. Injuries mattered symbolically. Outcomes were interpreted carefully rather than accepted at face value. One such injury, the damage to Horus's eye, became emblematic of the broader conflict. A damaged eye suggested incomplete vision, partial order. It was a visible sign that the world itself remained unsettled. The fact that the injury could be healed reinforced the belief that disorder was not permanent. The restoration of the eye required cooperation among gods. It was not achieved through Horus alone. This collective healing reinforced a core Egyptian idea. Restoration of order was communal. No single force could repair the cosmos in isolation. Throughout these events, Osiris exerted influence from the realm of the dead. His authority reminded the council that kingship was not confined to the living world. Decisions made now would shape the afterlife, as well as earthly existence. This broadened the scope of judgment. The gods began to recognize that the conflict between Horus and Seth was not a simple binary. It was a question of placement. Chaos had a role, but not at the center. Strength was necessary, but not sufficient. Legitimacy required continuity, recognition, and alignment with cosmic principles. This realization shifted the nature of the debate. The question became not whether Seth should exist, but where he belonged. Likewise, Horus's claim was reframed not as a challenge to Seth's necessity, but as a restoration of proper hierarchy. The political imagination of Egypt found comfort in this solution. It avoided extremes. It preserved strength without sacrificing legitimacy. It allowed chaos to function without allowing it to dominate. When the council moved toward resolution, it did so gradually. Decisions accumulated, precedents were set. Horus's endurance became evidence. Seth's provocations lost persuasive force. The balance of argument shifted. Horus did not emerge from this process transformed into a conqueror. He emerged affirmed as a governor of order. His authority rested not on victory alone, but on demonstrated alignment with the principles that sustained the universe. This process left a lasting imprint on Egyptian political thought. Human kingship mirrored divine governance. Pharaohs ruled not by whim, but through ritual, precedent, and acknowledgement. Courts, councils, and traditions reinforced authority rather than undermined it. The divine politics surrounding Horus's rise thus became a template. It taught that rightful rule required recognition, patience, and integration rather than domination. It taught that conflict could be resolved through structure rather than annihilation. As the narrative moves forward, these political foundations will shape everything that follows. Horus's eventual confirmation will not erase the memory of debate. Instead, it will validate the process that led there. The gods did not rush to restore order, they rebuilt it carefully. In doing so, they demonstrated a worldview that valued continuity over spectacle and stability over speed. In the quiet aftermath of prolonged deliberation, the cosmos began to realign, not because a battle had been won, but because authority had been clarified. This distinction mattered deeply to Egypt, and it would matter to every pharaoh who ruled in Horus's name. Hathor, Isis, and divine guidance. As the divine debates continued, and the future of kingship remained unresolved, Horus's development did not pause. While councils argued and precedents accumulated, a quieter form of shaping was underway, one that Egyptian tradition considered just as decisive as formal judgment. Horus was being guided. Not pushed forward, not armed for conquest, but steadied through instruction, correction, and care offered by deities whose authority did not rely on force. At the center of this guidance stood Isis, whose role had never diminished as Horus moved from hidden child to public claimant. Her influence, however, evolved. In the earliest years, her concern had been survival. Now it was suitability. She understood that the future king of Egypt would not be judged solely by lineage or strength, but by his capacity to sustain balance under pressure. Isis's approach was deliberate. She did not prepare Horus for a single decisive moment, but for endurance across time. Egyptian kingship was imagined as continuous labor rather than episodic triumph. A ruler did not complete his task by ascending the throne. He began it there. Isis therefore emphasized qualities that could be maintained rather than expended: patience, restraint, attention, and respect for process. Her instruction unfolded through ritual practice and example rather than direct command. Horus observed how she spoke to other gods not with submission, but with precision. She chose words carefully, understanding that speech shaped reality. Through this, Horus learned that authority could be exercised without confrontation, that persuasion and timing mattered as much as declaration. Alongside Isis, another goddess played a significant role in Horus's formation: Hathor. Hathor's presence in the narrative is sometimes misunderstood, reduced to gentleness or pleasure. In Egyptian thought, however, Hathor represented equilibrium. She embodied joy, not as indulgence, but as harmony restored. Her guidance complemented Isis's discipline by reminding Horus of what kingship existed to preserve. Hathor introduced Horus to the social dimensions of rule. Egypt did not imagine kingship as isolation at the top of a hierarchy. A king was embedded within his people, responsible for festivals, offerings, and emotional stability as much as for law and defense. Hathor's influence taught Horus that order was not sustained by fear alone. It required reassurance. This lesson mattered deeply in a world still unsettled by Osiris's murder. Anxiety lingered among gods and humans alike. Ritual celebration, music, and communal rites were not distractions, they were stabilizing forces. Hathor's presence reminded Horus that kingship must address the human need for continuity and meaning, not merely enforce structure. Together, Isis and Hathor shaped a balanced model of authority. Isis provided the framework knowledge, restraint, lawful succession. Hathor provided the atmosphere connection, continuity, and reassurance. Horus absorbed both, not as abstract ideals, but as lived practices. This guidance was especially important as Horus faced provocation from Seth. Seth's strategy relied on disruption. He sought to unsettle Horus emotionally, to provoke impulsive responses that would undermine his claim. In Egyptian political thought, loss of composure signaled unfitness to rule. A king who could not govern himself could not govern the world. Horus's restraint in these moments was not accidental. It reflected years of preparation under Isis's watchful care. When challenged, Horus responded through process rather than reaction. He returned to the council. He submitted to judgment. He demonstrated consistency. Each restrained response strengthened his legitimacy. The gods observed this closely. They were not only judging claims, they were evaluating governance styles. Horus's behavior contrasted sharply with Seth's volatility. Where Seth escalated, Horus endured. Where Seth asserted, Horus aligned. This difference gradually shifted the tone of divine deliberation. Hathor's influence also appeared in moments of reconciliation rather than confrontation. Egyptian myth valued the containment of conflict over its elimination. Hathor's role in calming tensions, restoring balance after episodes of violence, and reintegrating fractured relationships reinforced this worldview. Through her, Horus learned that a ruler's task included healing social ruptures, not just winning disputes. Isis reinforced this lesson through stories of Osiris. She emphasized that her husband's rule had been remembered not for conquest, but for cultivation. Agriculture, law, and ritual continuity formed the core of his legacy. Horus understood that to honor Osiris was not to replicate his fate, but to preserve his function. This understanding shaped Horus's interactions with the divine council. He did not frame his claim as a personal right, but as a restoration of disrupted order. He positioned himself as a caretaker rather than a victor. This framing resonated deeply with Egyptian political philosophy. During this period, Horus also encountered setbacks that tested his resolve. Delays persisted, decisions were revisited, trials were repeated. In some narratives, Horus appeared disadvantaged by procedural rulings that favored Seth's experience. Yet he did not withdraw. He continued to engage, reinforcing his image as stable and reliable. Isis's role in these moments was subtle. She did not challenge the authority of the council openly. Instead, she clarified principles. She reminded the gods of precedent. She invoked cosmic order rather than maternal privilege. This restraint enhanced her credibility and, by extension, Horus's. Hathor, meanwhile, reinforced the emotional stability of the divine community. She mediated tensions, restored goodwill, and ensured that prolonged conflict did not harden into permanent division. Her influence helped prevent the dispute from fracturing the divine order beyond repair. Together, these forms of guidance shaped Horus into a ruler aligned with Egyptian ideals. He did not emerge as an innovator disrupting tradition. He emerged as a restorer aligning with it. His authority felt familiar rather than threatening. This period also clarified the role of female deities in Egyptian political thought. Isis and Hathor were not peripheral figures, they were central to the maintenance of order. Their guidance demonstrated that kingship was not sustained by masculine force alone, but by a network of relational and ritual support. Egyptian culture did not imagine leadership as solitary. A king ruled within a system of gods, priests, traditions, and expectations. Horus's formation under Isis and Hathor reflected this reality. He was prepared to operate within structure rather than above it. As the conflict with Seth approached resolution, the influence of this guidance became increasingly visible. Horus's claim rested not only on lineage, but on demonstrated alignment with the values that sustained the cosmos. His patience, restraint, and capacity for restoration distinguished him clearly. The gods began to recognize that Horus did not seek to replace Seth's function, but to reposition it. This insight eased resistance. It allowed the council to imagine a resolution that preserved strength without sacrificing legitimacy. Isis's long labor of protection and instruction neared completion. Hathor's work of stabilization had prevented collapse. Together, they had shaped a ruler capable of inheriting not only a throne, but a system repaired through care. Horus stood ready, not because he had proven himself superior in force, but because he had demonstrated suitability in character. This distinction mattered profoundly in Egyptian thought. A ruler who embodied order would sustain it. A ruler who relied on domination would exhaust it. As the narrative moves forward, the guidance Horus received will bear fruit in moments of judgment and confirmation. The quiet work of preparation will prove as decisive as any contest. The world does not change suddenly. It shifts through accumulated alignment. In Horus's case, that alignment was forged through the steady influence of Isis and Hathor, through knowledge, patience, and the careful restoration of balance. The first confrontation with Seth, the long period of preparation, guidance, and deliberation eventually gave way to a moment that could no longer be postponed. Horus and Seth, whose rivalry had shaped the divine world for years, now stood in open opposition. This was not the beginning of conflict. The conflict had existed since the death of Osiris, but it was the first time that their opposition became fully explicit, formalized, and unavoidable. In Egyptian myth, confrontation did not automatically imply violence. It meant exposure. Claims that had been spoken indirectly were now stated plainly. Positions that had been implied were now tested. The universe itself demanded clarity, because unresolved authority threatened its stability. Seth did not approach this moment cautiously. He had ruled visibly for years and had grown accustomed to asserting dominance without challenge. His confidence rested on strength, experience, and the fact that no god had yet removed him. From his perspective, Horus was an unproven claimant, protected by others and delayed by procedure. Seth believed that a direct confrontation would reveal this weakness. Horus approached the moment differently. He did not see confrontation as an opportunity to overwhelm Seth. He saw it as an unavoidable step in a process already underway. The legitimacy of his claim would not be decided by his willingness to fight, but by how he conducted himself once challenged. The first formal confrontation between Horus and Seth unfolded under divine observation. The gods did not retreat or look away. They assembled to witness, because what happened next would establish precedent. Egyptian myth consistently emphasizes that power exercised without witnesses is incomplete. Recognition matters. Seth began by asserting his right to rule through action. He framed himself as Egypt's protector, the god who defended the borders against chaos beyond. He emphasized that strength preserved order, and that a ruler, unable to impose authority, would invite collapse. These arguments were not without merit. Egypt lived with constant awareness of external threat, and Seth embodied the force required to confront it. Horus did not deny Seth's role. Instead, he reframed it. He argued that protection without legitimacy became domination. Order sustained by fear alone could not endure. Kingship, he insisted, required alignment with lineage, ritual continuity, and cosmic balance. Without these, strength became destabilizing rather than protective. This exchange revealed a fundamental difference in worldview. Seth understood authority as control. Horus understood it as stewardship. The gods listened carefully, because both concepts existed within Egyptian political reality. The challenge lay in determining which belonged at the center. The confrontation escalated when Seth sought to provoke Horus into impulsive action. He challenged Horus's readiness, questioned his maturity, and framed patience as weakness. This strategy was deliberate. Egyptian culture viewed emotional volatility as dangerous in rulers. If Horus responded rashly, he would undermine his own claim. Horus resisted. His response was measured, restrained, and procedural. He did not retreat, but he did not escalate unnecessarily. This restraint frustrated Seth, whose strength relied on reaction and force. The contrast between them became increasingly visible. The gods began to introduce structured contests to resolve the dispute. These were not spontaneous fights, but regulated challenges designed to test specific qualities. Some emphasized endurance. Others tested judgment or restraint. Even when physical conflict occurred, it was contained within rules. In one such contest, violence did erupt. Horus and Seth engaged directly, and Horus was injured. This injury, the damage to his eye, became one of the most significant symbols in Egyptian mythology. The loss of the eye did not signify defeat. It represented imbalance, a world not yet whole. The gods did not interpret the injury as disqualifying. Instead, they treated it as evidence of the conflict's seriousness. Injury demanded response. Healing demanded cooperation. Horus's eye was restored through divine intervention, not through Horus's own strength alone. This restoration carried deep meaning. The healed eye symbolized completeness regained through process rather than dominance. It affirmed the belief that order could be repaired, but not instantly, and not through force alone. The Eye of Horus became a lasting emblem of protection, health, and restored balance, not invulnerability. Seth responded to this outcome with increased aggression. He viewed the restoration as favoritism and sought to reassert dominance. Yet each escalation weakened his position. His reliance on force contrasted increasingly with Horus's steadiness. The gods took note. Egyptian myth does not present divine judgment as arbitrary. It accumulates. Patterns matter. Horus's consistent alignment with process strengthened his claim over time. Seth's volatility undermined his own arguments. Throughout these confrontations, Isis remained present but restrained. She did not intervene to secure immediate victory. She allowed Horus to face risk, understanding that legitimacy required exposure to challenge. Protection had prepared him. Now endurance would confirm him. Osiris, ruling from the realm of the dead, continued to exert influence. His presence reminded the gods that kingship extended beyond life, that decisions made now would shape the afterlife as well as the living world. This perspective reinforced the importance of lawful succession. The first confrontation did not resolve the conflict. It clarified it. The gods now understood that this was not a contest that could be settled through a single victory. It was a question of placement, balance, and long-term stability. For Horus, this realization reinforced the necessity of patience. He did not expect immediate affirmation. He understood that the process itself was part of restoration. Each confrontation refined his claim rather than exhausting it. For Seth, the confrontation revealed limits. Strength alone could not secure lasting authority. Provocation without legitimacy led to stalemate rather than resolution. His role within the cosmic order was being questioned, not erased, but redefined. Egyptian myth emphasizes that clarity emerges through sustained engagement rather than sudden triumph. The first confrontation between Horus and Seth exemplified this principle. It exposed the nature of their rivalry and established the terms under which it would continue. The cosmos did not collapse during this confrontation, but it did not fully stabilize either. The conflict remained active, unresolved, and consequential. Yet something had shifted. The question was no longer whether Horus had a claim, but whether Seth's rule could endure scrutiny. This shift mattered profoundly. It marked the transition from hidden preparation to open contest, from inheritance delayed to inheritance tested. Horus had stepped fully into visibility, not as a conqueror, but as a claimant committed to restoration. As the confrontation concluded, the gods withdrew, not with a verdict, but with awareness. They had seen enough to know that the conflict would not be decided quickly. They would continue to observe, test, and deliberate. Horus returned from this encounter not triumphant, but intact. His injury had been healed. His composure remained. His claim had survived its first public trial. In Egyptian thought, survival under scrutiny was itself a form of success. The path forward remained difficult. More trials would follow, more delays would test endurance. But the first confrontation had achieved something essential. It had made the conflict explicit and visible within the framework of order. From this point onward, Horus was no longer merely the hidden heir. He was an active participant in divine politics, subject to judgment and capable of meeting it. The universe had acknowledged him as such. In the quiet aftermath of confrontation, balance had not yet returned, but it had been engaged. The process of restoration was underway, measured not in battles won, but in alignment maintained, the eye lost and restored. The injury to Horus's eye did not conclude the struggle, it deepened it. In Egyptian thought, wounds carried meaning beyond pain. They signaled imbalance, distortion, and interruption. When Horus lost his eye during confrontation with Seth, the event was not treated as an unfortunate consequence of conflict, but as a revelation about the state of the world itself. An eye was not merely an organ of sight, it represented perception, judgment, and completeness. To lose an eye was to see imperfectly, to govern without full clarity. In a universe that depended on balance, such a wound mattered profoundly. The gods did not respond with panic, nor did they dismiss the injury as a temporary setback. They recognized it as evidence that the dispute over kingship remained unresolved and that order itself was still incomplete. For Horus, the loss was significant, but not disabling. He did not retreat from the process, nor did he interpret the injury as disqualification. Instead, he endured it. This response aligned closely with Egyptian ideals of rulership. A king was expected to maintain composure under strain, to remain oriented toward restoration rather than reaction. Horus's steadiness after injury reinforced his suitability in the eyes of the divine council. The period following the loss of the eye was marked by careful attention to healing. In Egyptian culture, healing was not a private act. It was communal, ritualized, and meaningful. The restoration of Horus's eye involved multiple gods, coordinated effort, and time. This mattered. Restoration achieved through cooperation reinforced the belief that order was sustained collectively. The healing process also underscored the limits of individual power. Horus did not heal himself through strength alone. He received aid. This did not weaken his claim, it strengthened it. A ruler who acknowledged interdependence demonstrated alignment with cosmic principles. Egyptian kingship was never imagined as solitary dominance. It functioned within networks of divine, ritual, and social support. As the eye was restored, it took on symbolic weight that extended far beyond the immediate conflict. The restored eye came to represent wholeness regained after disruption, health restored through care, and order repaired through patience. It was not a symbol of invulnerability, it was a symbol of recovery. This distinction mattered deeply. Egyptian culture did not idealize perfection, it valued balance. A restored eye acknowledged that injury had occurred, that loss had been real, and that restoration required effort. This aligned with the broader narrative of kingship following Osiris's murder. The world could not return to an untouched state, it could only be repaired. The gods interpreted the restoration carefully. They did not declare the conflict resolved. Instead, they recognized that the capacity for restoration existed. This recognition shifted the tone of deliberation. The question was no longer whether order could be restored, but who was best suited to maintain it. Seth's response to the healing was revealing. He viewed the restoration as a challenge to his authority. To him, injury should have ended Horus's claim. The fact that Horus endured and recovered undermined Seth's reliance on force. Strength that could injure but not eliminate became less persuasive as a foundation for rule. Horus's response remained consistent. He did not celebrate the restoration as victory, he treated it as readiness. The healed eye allowed him to see clearly again, but clarity did not mean haste. He returned to the council, continuing the process rather than demanding resolution. This restraint reinforced Egyptian beliefs about timing. A ruler who rushed to capitalize on advantage risked destabilizing the balance he sought to restore. Horus's patience after recovery demonstrated maturity rather than opportunism. The Eye of Horus also began to function as a protective symbol beyond the immediate narrative. It came to be used in amulets, rituals, and healing practices throughout Egypt. This expansion reflected how myth informed daily life. The story of Horus's injury and recovery provided a framework for understanding illness, recovery, and protection in human experience. In this way, Horus's personal ordeal became communal knowledge. The restoration of the eye reassured Egyptians that injury did not signal permanent loss, that disorder could be addressed through care and ritual. This reassurance mattered in a culture acutely aware of vulnerability to disease, famine, and political instability. Within the divine conflict, the restored eye altered perceptions subtly but decisively. Horus was no longer merely a claimant enduring delay. He had demonstrated resilience. He had shown that injury did not compromise his alignment with order. He had remained oriented toward restoration rather than retaliation. The gods began to see that Horus's suitability lay not in unchallenged strength, but in sustained coherence. He could absorb disruption without becoming it. This quality distinguished him sharply from Seth, whose responses increasingly escalated rather than stabilized. Osiris's influence from the realm of the dead continued to shape interpretation. His presence reminded the gods that kingship extended beyond visible conflict. A ruler's ability to restore order after injury mirrored the broader cycle of death and renewal that Osiris governed. Horus's recovery aligned him with this cycle. The symbolism of the eye also clarified the nature of judgment the gods were rendering. They were not selecting the strongest combatant. They were selecting the figure most capable of maintaining clarity over time. Vision, both literal and symbolic, mattered. A ruler who saw fully could govern justly. As deliberations continued, the restored eye became a reference point. It demonstrated that Horus's claim could withstand disruption. It provided evidence that restoration was possible under his stewardship. This evidence accumulated alongside his lineage, restraint, and endurance. The conflict with Seth did not cease after the restoration. Further trials followed, but the terms had shifted. Injury no longer signaled failure. Recovery no longer signaled favoritism. The process itself had proven its capacity to repair imbalance. Horus continued to participate without escalating demands. He did not seek to punish Seth for the injury. This restraint reinforced the Egyptian belief that justice was not revenge, it was alignment. Punishment that disrupted balance was no justice at all. Seth's position weakened gradually. His inability to adapt to this framework made his reliance on force increasingly out of place. He represented disruption, but disruption without reintegration threatened the stability he claimed to protect. The Eye of Horus thus became more than a symbol. It became a criterion. It represented the standard by which rulership was judged. The ability to restore clarity after disruption, to see fully again after loss, and to maintain order without denying vulnerability. As time passed, the eye's symbolism spread into human practice. Amulets bearing its image were used for protection. Measurements in trade referenced its fractions. Healing rituals invoked its restoration. This integration reflected how deeply the myth resonated with Egyptian experience. Horus's story was not confined to divine politics. It offered a model for living within a precarious world. Injury would occur, loss would be felt. Restoration required patience, care, and cooperation. These principles applied as much to farming communities and households as to kingship. Within the narrative of succession, the restored eye marked a turning point. It did not end the conflict, but it clarified its direction. The gods increasingly recognized that Horus embodied the values necessary to sustain order across time. The eye that had been lost and restored now watched over the process itself. It symbolized attention, awareness, and completeness regained through effort. It reassured the cosmos that clarity was possible, even after disruption. As the narrative continues, the Eye of Horus will remain present, not as a reminder of injury alone, but as evidence that restoration lies at the heart of rightful rule. Horus had shown that he could lose without collapsing, recover without triumphalism, and continue without distortion. This capacity mattered more than any single contest. It demonstrated readiness for kingship defined not by spectacle, but by stability. The world moved one step closer to balance, not through victory, but through repair. Trials before the Eniad. The restoration of Horus's eye did not bring immediate resolution. In Egyptian thought, healing did not conclude judgment. It made judgment possible. With balance partially restored, the gods were now obligated to proceed carefully. What followed was not a single decisive hearing, but a prolonged series of trials conducted before the Eniad, the collective body of gods responsible for maintaining cosmic order. These trials were not conceived as spectacles. They were deliberate, measured, and often slow. Egyptian mythology reflects a deep discomfort with rushed authority. A ruler chosen too quickly risked destabilizing the world. The Eniad therefore approached the dispute between Horus and Seth with procedural care, even when the tension was evident. The trials served several purposes at once. They tested claims of legitimacy. They examined behavior under pressure. They clarified the roles each god would occupy within the cosmic system. Importantly, they also allowed the divine community to witness the process. In Egyptian culture, visibility and recognition mattered. Authority gained without communal acknowledgement remained incomplete. Horus entered these trials without urgency. His approach reflected the years he had spent in preparation and restraint. He did not demand immediate affirmation. He presented his claim consistently, grounded in lineage, continuity, and alignment with Maat. His demeanor was steady, neither aggressive nor withdrawn. Seth approached the trials differently. He treated them as obstacles rather than processes. Accustomed to asserting power through action, he found deliberation frustrating. His arguments emphasized effectiveness and force. He reminded the gods of the dangers beyond Egypt's borders and positioned himself as indispensable protection against external chaos. The Eniad listened to both perspectives. Egyptian mythology does not portray the gods as naive or easily swayed. They understood that chaos was not an abstract concept. Storms, deserts, and foreign threats were real. Seth's role as defender of boundaries was acknowledged. The challenge lay in determining whether that role justified central authority. The trials unfolded over time, sometimes returning to earlier points rather than advancing linearly. This circularity reflected Egyptian attitudes toward decision-making. Revisiting arguments was not seen as weakness, it was caution. The gods sought not novelty, but reassurance that their eventual judgment would endure. In some trials, Horus and Seth were asked to demonstrate qualities rather than argue claims. These demonstrations did not always involve combat. Endurance, judgment, and restraint were tested alongside strength. The gods observed not only outcomes, but methods, how each god responded to challenge, mattered as much as the challenge itself. Horus consistently aligned his actions with process. When delayed, he waited. When tested, he complied. When injured, he accepted healing without complaint. This consistency reinforced his image as a stabilizing force. He did not attempt to circumvent the council or undermine its authority. Seth's responses, by contrast, often escalated. When frustrated, he pressed harder. When challenged, he sought to dominate. These responses revealed a tension between his function and his claim. As a force at the edges of order, Seth's aggression had purpose. At the center, it became destabilizing. The Eniad also considered precedent. Egyptian mythology valued continuity not only in kingship, but in judgment itself. Past rulings informed present decisions. Osiris's reign served as a benchmark. His rule had embodied balance, continuity, and lawful succession. Horus's claim aligned with that legacy. Seth's seizure of power did not. Osiris's presence, though indirect, remained influential. From the realm of the dead, he represented the continuity of kingship beyond life. His authority reminded the gods that their decision would echo across generations, shaping both the living and the dead. This broadened the scope of judgment beyond immediate concerns. As the trials continued, the gods began to recognize a pattern. Horus's suitability did not rest on a single decisive moment. It emerged through accumulation. Each trial added evidence. Each restrained response reinforced his alignment with order. Legitimacy, in this framework, was built rather than seized. The Eniad's hesitation persisted, not because Horus lacked merit, but because the consequences of affirmation were profound. Once Horus was confirmed, Seth's role would change permanently. The gods needed to ensure that this transition preserved cosmic stability rather than undermining it. This concern led to trials that explored compromise. Could Seth retain a role without ruling? Could chaos be contained without being erased? These questions reflected Egyptian pragmatism. The world was not imagined as free from disruption. It was imagined as capable of managing it. Horus's responses to these considerations were telling. He did not insist on Seth's elimination. He framed his claim as restoration rather than replacement. This distinction reassured the Eniad. It suggested that Horus understood the complexity of governance, including the necessity of forces beyond order itself. The trials also served an educational function for Horus. They exposed him to the mechanics of authority, debate, and collective decision-making. He learned that kingship involved negotiation as much as command. This experience prepared him to rule within a system rather than above it. For Seth, the trials exposed limitations. His reliance on force proved insufficient in a context that demanded integration. The gods did not reject his strength outright, but they questioned its placement. This questioning marked a shift. Seth's authority was no longer assumed, it was scrutinized. The Eniad's role as arbiter reinforced a core Egyptian belief that order was maintained through institutions, not personalities alone. Even gods were subject to process. This belief mirrored human governance, where councils, rituals, and traditions reinforced authority. As deliberations stretched on, impatience did not undermine legitimacy. Instead, it revealed character. Horus's patience strengthened his claim. Seth's frustration weakened his. The gods observed this dynamic carefully, understanding that a ruler's response to delay predicted his response to crisis. Eventually, the trials began to converge toward resolution, not through a dramatic verdict, but through gradual consensus. The Eniad did not announce a sudden change. They allowed recognition to crystallize through repeated affirmation. Horus emerged from these trials not as a victor over Seth, but as the clearer candidate for central authority. His alignment with Mat, his endurance under scrutiny, and his willingness to integrate rather than dominate distinguished him decisively. The Eniad's process demonstrated that legitimacy in Egyptian thought was not bestowed lightly. It was earned through consistency, recognition, and alignment with cosmic principles. Horus met these criteria not by outshining Seth in force, but by outlasting him in coherence. The trials also clarified Seth's future role. He would not be erased. His function at the edges of order remained necessary. But his claim to central authority could not be sustained without undermining the system he helped defend. This resolution reflected Egyptian balance. Chaos was acknowledged, not denied. Strength was valued, but constrained. Order was restored, not by eliminating opposition, but by repositioning it. As the trials before the Eniad concluded, the world did not erupt in celebration. It settled. Decisions that endure do not announce themselves loudly. They integrate quietly, reshaping structure rather than drawing attention. Horus's readiness for kingship was now evident not through spectacle, but through sustained alignment. The Eniad had fulfilled its role as guardian of cosmic order. The process had held. The narrative now moves toward confirmation, but it does so grounded in deliberation rather than triumph. The trials before the Eniad had done their work. Authority had been tested, refined, and clarified. In the calm that followed, the cosmos leaned toward balance once more, not because conflict had vanished, but because it had been placed where it belonged. Horus stood prepared to assume the center not as a conqueror, but as a steward shaped by trial, setbacks, deceptions, and stalemate. The trials before the Eniad had clarified much, but they had not yet delivered final resolution. Egyptian mythology is careful here. It does not allow clarity to arrive cleanly or quickly. Instead, it acknowledges a prolonged middle phase 1, defined by setbacks, misjudgments, and deliberate deception during which the future of kingship remains uncertain, even as its direction becomes increasingly visible. This period was not marked by open triumph or decisive failure. It was characterized by stalemate. Authority hovered without fully settling. The gods continued to deliberate, and the cosmos remained functional but strained. In Egyptian thought, this state was dangerous precisely because it could persist. Unresolved authority was not explosive, it was corrosive. For Horus, this phase tested endurance more severely than any injury or confrontation. He had demonstrated legitimacy, restraint, and alignment with order. Yet recognition still lagged. This delay was not a sign of doubt, but of caution. The Eniad understood that once a final verdict was issued, the structure of divine and human governance would shift permanently. Seth responded to this delay with increasing agitation. He perceived the stalemate as opportunity. If resolution could be postponed indefinitely, his de facto rule could continue. He therefore turned to deception not as an isolated tactic, but as a strategy designed to destabilize the process itself. Deception, in Egyptian myth, carried particular weight. Unlike force, which was acknowledged as necessary in certain contexts, deception undermined trust and order directly. Seth's earlier murder of Osiris had already established a pattern. Now, he extended that pattern into the political arena. He challenged procedural boundaries. He manipulated trials. He sought to provoke reactions that would discredit Horus. In some accounts, Seth attempted to blur distinctions between roles, claiming rights that did not align with lineage or precedent. These actions did not go unnoticed, but they complicated deliberation. The gods found themselves repeatedly returning to earlier questions. Was Seth indispensable? Could Horus govern without destabilizing defenses? Could chaos be repositioned without weakening the system? Each deceptive maneuver forced the Eniad to re-examine assumptions rather than advance toward conclusion. For Horus, the challenge lay in response. He could not ignore deception, but he could not counter it through similar means without undermining his own claim. Egyptian kingship demanded moral clarity. A ruler who adopted the tactics of disorder became indistinguishable from it. Horus therefore responded through consistency rather than retaliation. When Seth distorted process, Horus reaffirmed it. When Seth escalated, Horus steadied. This approach did not produce immediate results, but it preserved coherence. Over time, coherence itself became evidence. The stalemate also revealed limits within the Eniad. The gods were powerful, but not omniscient. They grappled with uncertainty. Egyptian mythology does not portray divine councils as infallible. It presents them as responsible. Responsibility included hesitation when outcomes carried lasting consequences. This hesitation frustrated Seth. Accustomed to dominance through action, he found sustained deliberation intolerable. His responses became increasingly reactive. Each attempt to force resolution revealed further misalignment between his methods and the values underpinning central authority. The gods observed this pattern closely. Egyptian judgment accumulated through observation rather than decree. Patterns mattered more than isolated incidents. Seth's repeated deceptions did not disqualify him immediately, but they weakened his claim incrementally. Horus, by contrast, gained credibility through endurance. He demonstrated that he could withstand delay without abandoning principle. This mattered deeply in a culture where kingship was imagined as lifelong labor rather than episodic achievement. The stalemate also allowed the gods to consider the broader implications of their decision. Kingship was not merely symbolic. It structured ritual calendars, agricultural cycles, and social hierarchy. A misjudgment would ripple outward, affecting both divine and human realms. This awareness reinforced caution. The Eniad resisted pressure to conclude prematurely. Instead, they allowed the stalemate to reveal character. Time became a testing instrument. During this period, Osiris's influence grew more pronounced. From the realm of the dead, he embodied continuity beyond conflict. His authority reminded the gods that kingship was not confined to immediate effectiveness. It extended across generations, linking life and afterlife into a single system. Osiris's presence reframed the stalemate. It suggested that delay itself could serve restoration. Time allowed wounds to heal, deceptions to surface, and alignments to clarify. Egyptian mythology often treats time as an ally of order rather than its enemy. Seth's deceptions increasingly appeared short-sighted within this framework. Each attempt to manipulate process produced immediate advantage but long-term instability. The gods recognized this pattern. A ruler who relied on deception would perpetuate disorder rather than contain it. Horus's patience, meanwhile, began to redefine strength. Strength was no longer measured solely by force or decisiveness. It included the capacity to sustain alignment under pressure. Horus's restraint did not weaken his claim, it distinguished it. The stalemate also affected the cosmos subtly. Rituals continued, the Nile followed its course, yet underlying uncertainty persisted. Egyptian myth reflects this tension carefully. Order can function imperfectly for a time, but prolonged ambiguity strains its foundations. This strain heightened the urgency of resolution without justifying haste. The Eniad balanced these pressures deliberately. They understood that legitimacy imposed under strain would not endure. Seth attempted to exploit this tension by presenting himself as the practical choice. He argued that ongoing uncertainty itself was dangerous, and that decisive authority, his authority, was preferable to prolonged deliberation. This argument resonated superficially. Egypt valued stability, but the gods recognized a contradiction. Authority gained by exploiting fear of uncertainty risked entrenching disorder. Stability achieved through coercion lacked resilience. The gods sought a stability that could absorb disruption without collapsing. Horus's approach aligned with this goal. He did not promise immediate certainty. He promised continuity. His claim suggested that order restored through legitimate process would endure beyond immediate crisis. The stalemate thus became a proving ground, not for power, but for vision. The gods evaluated not only who could rule, but how the world would function under that rule. Gradually, the effects of deception accumulated. Seth's maneuvers lost persuasive force. Each revealed more about his methods than his suitability. The gods' patience began to yield clarity. This clarity did not arrive as sudden revelation. It emerged through contrast. Horus's consistency stood increasingly alone. Where Seth shifted tactics, Horus maintained alignment. Where Seth escalated, Horus stabilized. The stalemate therefore served its purpose. It exposed underlying structures. It revealed which claim could endure time, scrutiny, and uncertainty without distortion. Egyptian mythology treats this phase with seriousness because it reflects lived experience. Societies often endure prolonged uncertainty before resolution. Leaders are tested not only by crises, but by waiting. Horus passed this test not by winning arguments, but by sustaining coherence. His identity as restorer rather than conqueror became unmistakable. The gods began to converge quietly toward conclusion, not because Seth had been defeated outright, but because his claim could not withstand accumulated evidence. Deception had eroded trust. Impatience had revealed misalignment. The stalemate began to dissolve not through dramatic decree, but through consensus forming beneath the surface. The Eniad's deliberations grew shorter, objections lost force, recognition approached inevitability. For Horus, this shift did not prompt celebration. He remained steady. Egyptian kingship demanded readiness, not triumphalism. A ruler who celebrated prematurely risked destabilizing the very order he sought to restore. As this phase drew toward its end, the cosmos responded subtly. Ritual coherence strengthened, authority clarified. The long pause that had defined Horus's early life began to lift. The stalemate had not been wasted time. It had refined judgment, exposed deception, and tested endurance. It had allowed order to reassert itself gradually, rather than abruptly. In Egyptian thought, such resolution was ideal. It preserved continuity while acknowledging disruption. It restored balance without denying complexity. The narrative now moves toward decisive affirmation, but it does so grounded in the lessons of stalemate, that authority must endure time, that deception undermines itself, and that restoration emerges through patience rather than force. The world had waited. Now it was ready. Osiris speaks from the Duat. The stalemate had stretched long enough for its own weight to become apparent. The gods had observed patterns, tested endurance, and allowed time to expose the strengths and limits of each claim. What remained unresolved was not evidence, but authority, the question of who could speak with final legitimacy when the living world reached its limits. In Egyptian thought, that authority did not belong exclusively to the living. It extended into death, where continuity was preserved rather than extinguished. It was at this point that Osiris asserted his presence more clearly. Osiris had never been absent. From the moment of his murder, he had ruled the Duat, the realm that lay beyond visible life. But now his role shifted from silent guarantor to active voice. This transition mattered deeply. Egyptian culture understood death not as removal, but as relocation. Authority endured across that boundary, and when the living world reached an impasse, the dead could speak with particular clarity. The Duat was not imagined as a distant or abstract place. It was structured, governed, and morally ordered. Osiris presided over judgment, renewal, and continuity. His position gave him a perspective unavailable to the living gods, whose concerns were bound to immediate balance and visible stability. Osiris saw the long arc of order, how decisions echoed beyond a single reign. When Osiris addressed the Eniad, his words did not carry urgency or anger. They carried weight. He reminded the gods that kingship was not merely a function of power, but of lineage, continuity, and moral alignment. His murder had disrupted order, but it had not erased responsibility. The system demanded repair, not accommodation of disruption. This intervention reframed the debate decisively. Until now, the Eniad had balanced competing necessities: Seth's strength and Horus's legitimacy. Osiris's voice introduced a deeper criterion. Kingship, he argued, was not defined by effectiveness alone. It was defined by rightful succession and the maintenance of Maat across generations. Osiris did not demand vengeance. Egyptian myth is careful here. Revenge would have perpetuated imbalance rather than resolving it. Instead, Osiris emphasized restoration. His authority from the Duat underscored that death itself had been integrated into the cosmic system. If kingship could endure death, it could not be legitimately seized through violence. This argument carried unique force because Osiris embodied its consequences. He ruled the dead because he had been wronged. He maintained order in the afterlife precisely because order had been violated in life. His perspective was not theoretical, it was structural. The gods listened with renewed attention. Osiris's role clarified something that prolonged deliberation alone could not. The dispute was not only about present stability, but about the future coherence of the system. A decision that compromised lineage and legitimacy would reverberate indefinitely, undermining the cycle of life, death, and renewal that defined Egyptian cosmology. For Horus, Osiris's intervention did not change his behavior. He did not seize the moment or press his advantage. This restraint mattered. It demonstrated that his claim did not depend on sudden endorsement, but on sustained alignment with principle. He allowed Osiris's authority to speak for itself. Seth's response revealed the limits of his position. He could not counter Osiris's argument without undermining the very system that legitimized his own role. To deny the authority of the dead would have destabilized the structure of judgment he relied upon to justify his actions. This contradiction weakened his claim decisively. The Eniad began to converge. The question was no longer framed as a competition between equals. It became a matter of placement within the cosmic order. Horus belonged at the center, maintaining continuity and lawful succession. Seth belonged at the margins, containing chaos without dominating order. Osiris's voice from the Duat thus accomplished what prolonged trials could not. It provided a reference point beyond immediate power dynamics. It reminded the gods that kingship was part of a larger system linking life, death, and renewal into a single continuum. This intervention also reinforced Egyptian beliefs about governance. Human kingship mirrored divine order. Pharaohs ruled not only through visible authority, but through alignment with ancestral legitimacy. The dead kings mattered. Their judgment mattered. Decisions made without regard for this continuity risked unraveling the system itself. The Duat's involvement elevated the resolution beyond mere arbitration. It transformed the conflict into a lesson about authority. True legitimacy did not originate in force or convenience. It emerged from alignment with a system that transcended individual lives. The gods responded accordingly. Their deliberations narrowed, objections fell away. The logic of restoration over accommodation became dominant. Horus's claim, long sustained through endurance and restraint, now aligned fully with the broader structure Osiris articulated. Importantly, this shift did not produce immediate proclamation. Egyptian mythology resists abrupt endings. Instead, recognition settled gradually. The Eniad's consensus solidified not through announcement, but through action. Rituals aligned, roles clarified, the center of order reasserted itself. Osiris's continued presence ensured that this resolution did not erase the past. His murder remained acknowledged, loss remained integrated. The system moved forward without pretending that disruption had never occurred. This integration was essential. Order restored through denial would have been fragile. For Seth, the outcome required adjustment rather than annihilation. His function remained necessary, but his authority changed. The Duat's perspective made clear that chaos had a place, but not at the center of kingship. Seth's strength would be redirected rather than eliminated. Horus's response to this redefinition was critical. He did not seek to humiliate Seth or erase his role. He accepted a system in which balance required differentiation. This acceptance reinforced his suitability as ruler. A king who understood limits could maintain order longer than one who sought total dominance. Osiris's intervention also clarified the moral dimension of kingship. Justice was not punishment alone, it was alignment. The system did not demand Seth's destruction, it demanded his repositioning. This outcome reflected Egyptian pragmatism and moral restraint. The involvement of the Duat thus marked a turning point. It closed the phase of uncertainty without spectacle. It allowed the conflict to resolve through integration rather than conquest. Authority returned to its proper place without destabilizing the system that required it. For Horus, this moment confirmed what years of preparation had shaped. He was not a ruler because he overcame adversity through force. He was a ruler because he embodied continuity across disruption. His claim had endured scrutiny from the living and affirmation from the dead. As the Eniad adjusted to this clarity, the cosmos responded. Ritual coherence strengthened. The underlying tension eased. The system began to function with renewed confidence. The Duat's voice did not linger loudly. Once spoken, it receded into its governing role. Egyptian myth respects boundaries. The dead advise when needed, then return to their domain. Osiris resumed his work as judge and guarantor of renewal, leaving the living world to enact the order he had affirmed. This restraint reinforced the legitimacy of the resolution. Authority that lingered excessively risked undermining the autonomy of the living system. Osiris spoke, then withdrew. The system stood. The narrative now moved toward confirmation in life, rather than affirmation from death. Horus would assume kingship not as an avenger, but as a continuer. His authority would be enacted daily through ritual, governance, and the maintenance of Ma'at. The long path to this moment had been deliberate. Egyptian mythology insists on this slowness. Order restored too quickly lacks depth. Order restored through endurance embeds itself. Osiris's voice from the Duat ensured that the restoration carried memory. The world would move forward not by forgetting the rupture, but by incorporating it into continuity. As the phase of judgment concluded, the cosmos leaned fully toward balance, not because conflict had been erased, but because it had been resolved within a structure that could sustain it. The next step would be public confirmation, visible, enacted, and binding. But that confirmation rested firmly on what had already occurred. Recognition grounded in lineage, endurance proven through delay, and authority affirmed by the dead as well as the living. The system had spoken. The world was ready. Human kings mirror the gods. With the dispute among the gods moving toward resolution, its consequences began to extend beyond the divine realm. In Egyptian understanding, this transition was inevitable. Myth was never confined to story alone. It functioned as a template for life. What occurred among the gods established the structure through which human society organized itself. As Horus's position clarified in the divine order, his role within the human world took on renewed definition. Egyptian kingship had always been more than political authority. It was a sacred office grounded in cosmic responsibility. A king did not rule merely by command or conquest. He ruled by embodying order, by standing as the living axis between heaven and earth. The resolution of the Horus-Seth conflict, therefore, mattered deeply for every human ruler who would follow. Horus's emergence as rightful ruler provided a model of kingship defined not by dominance, but by continuity. This distinction shaped how Egyptians understood leadership for centuries. A pharaoh was not expected to be the strongest individual in the land. He was expected to be the most aligned. From the earliest dynasties, Egyptian rulers were identified explicitly with Horus. Royal names were framed within a Horus title, associating the living king directly with the falcon god. This identification was not metaphorical. It expressed the belief that the king was Horus in life, the active maintainer of order, just as he would become Osiris in death. This framework resolved a fundamental problem of governance: succession. By aligning kingship with divine continuity rather than personal achievement, Egypt created a system in which authority could pass predictably across generations. The king did not create order anew. He inherited it, maintained it, and passed it on. The story of Horus provided reassurance that rightful succession could survive disruption. Osiris had been murdered. Chaos had occupied the center. Yet order was restored through patience, judgment, and alignment rather than endless violence. This narrative offered hope that even in times of political instability, legitimacy could be reclaimed. Human kingship adopted this lesson directly. Pharaohs emphasized lineage, ritual continuity, and adherence to tradition. Innovation was approached cautiously. Sudden change risked imbalance. Stability was prized not because Egypt feared change, but because it understood its consequences. Ritual played a central role in reinforcing this structure. Daily temple offerings, seasonal festivals, and public ceremonies reaffirmed the king's role as Horus. These acts were not symbolic performances alone, they were believed to sustain the universe itself. A lapse in ritual threatened cosmic balance as surely as a lapse in law. The king's body became a focal point of this responsibility. His health, comportment, and behavior mattered. A ruler who acted impulsively or dishonorably risked disrupting Ma'at. This belief reinforced restraint as a royal virtue. Horus's patience during prolonged trials provided the ideal example. Egyptian texts consistently describe the king as shepherd rather than conqueror. He fed the gods, protected the people, and maintained justice. Military force existed, but it was framed as defense rather than domination. This framing mirrored Horus's acceptance of Seth's continued role at the margins. The integration of chaos, rather than its elimination, became a defining feature of Egyptian political philosophy. Foreign lands, deserts, and storms were dangerous but necessary. The king's task was not to erase these forces, but to contain them. Horus's settlement with Seth provided the mythic precedent. This philosophy influenced foreign policy as well. Egypt often preferred buffer zones, diplomacy, and symbolic dominance over total annihilation. When conquest occurred, it was ritualized and incorporated into existing structures rather than celebrated as destruction for its own sake. Kingship also absorbed the moral lessons of the divine conflict. Deception was dangerous. Seth's reliance on manipulation undermined his claim. Egyptian rulers were therefore expected to rule transparently through visible alignment with tradition and law. While reality did not always match ideal, the standard remained clear. Legal systems reflected this emphasis. Courts operated under the concept of ma'at rather than arbitrary authority. Judges were expected to restore balance rather than simply punish. This mirrored Horus's refusal to seek vengeance and his preference for restoration. The afterlife reinforced these principles. A king's judgment did not end with death. As Osiris ruled the Duat, so too would dead kings be judged by their adherence to order. This belief placed ethical constraints on power. Authority exercised unjustly would echo beyond life. Royal architecture embodied these ideas physically. Temples aligned with celestial movements, tombs were constructed to ensure continuity. Statues portrayed kings in calm, controlled poses rather than moments of action. Stillness conveyed stability. The falcon imagery associated with Horus reinforced oversight rather than aggression. The falcon sees broadly, from above, with clarity. This perspective symbolized the king's duty to perceive the whole, rather than fixate on immediate threats. Even royal regalia reflected this philosophy. The crown combined symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt, expressing unity rather than dominance of one over the other. This echoed Horus's role in restoring coherence to a divided world. Education for future kings emphasized tradition. Princes were trained in ritual, administration, and moral conduct as much as in warfare. Horus's upbringing under Isis and Hathor provided the mythic foundation for this practice. The king's relationship with priests mirrored the divine council's role. Authority was not exercised in isolation. Council mattered, precedent mattered, ritual procedure mattered. A king who ignored these structures risked destabilizing the system that supported him. This system also allowed for criticism without rebellion. A king who failed to uphold ma'at could be described as falling short of Horus's ideal without immediately overthrowing him. This conceptual space provided resilience. Over centuries, Egyptian kingship endured precisely because it was conservative in structure. While dynasties rose and fell, the underlying framework remained remarkably consistent. Horus's story anchored this continuity. Even during periods of foreign rule, Egyptian kings adopted Horus imagery. They understood that legitimacy in Egypt required alignment with its mythic structure. The story of Horus proved adaptable without losing its core meaning. This adaptability was crucial. Horus was not a rigid symbol. He represented principles that could be expressed across changing circumstances: rightful succession, restraint, restoration, and balance. The integration of myth and governance also shaped how ordinary Egyptians understood their place in the world. Just as Horus restored order after disruption, individuals were encouraged to restore balance within their households and communities. The cosmic and the domestic mirrored each other. Agricultural cycles reinforced this worldview. Floods disrupted fields, but receded predictably. Order returned through patience and preparation. Horus's narrative echoed this rhythm, making it deeply familiar. The king's public presence reinforced reassurance. Processions, festivals, and monuments communicated stability. The king did not need to prove his power daily. His role was to reassure continuity. This reassurance mattered in a world vulnerable to uncertainty. Famine, disease, and invasion were real threats. The belief that the king embodied Horus provided psychological stability alongside practical governance. As Horus's divine authority settled fully into place, its human reflection became institutionalized. Kingship was no longer a personal contest. It was an office sustained through ritual, law, and memory. This transformation marked one of the most enduring achievements of Egyptian civilization. By grounding political authority in mythic continuity rather than personal charisma, Egypt created a system capable of extraordinary longevity. Horus's legacy thus extended far beyond his own narrative. He became the standard by which rulers were measured, the lens through which authority was understood, and the guarantor of order in both heaven and earth. The human king did not replace the god, he mirrored him. This mirroring ensured that divine order remained present in daily life, enacted through governance rather than imposed through fear. As the narrative moves forward, Horus's role will continue to evolve, but his integration into human kingship marks a decisive turning point. The conflict that began with Osiris's murder now yielded a structure capable of enduring centuries. Order had been restored not only among the gods, but within society itself. The cosmos and the state aligned. The falcon spread its wings over both, the final verdict of rule. The long arc of deliberation had narrowed to a point where continuation without decision risked undoing the very order the gods were sworn to protect. Egyptian mythology is precise in marking this moment. It is not portrayed as a sudden revelation or dramatic confrontation, but as an accumulation finally reaching coherence. The evidence had been gathered. The patterns had revealed themselves. What remained was affirmation. The Eniad, having weighed lineage, conduct, endurance, and alignment with Maat, moved toward a verdict that had been forming gradually beneath the surface. This decision was not framed as victory for one side and annihilation for the other. It was framed as placement assigning each force its proper role within the cosmic structure. At the center of this verdict stood Horus. Horus was not declared ruler because he had overcome every obstacle through strength. He was affirmed because he had remained coherent across disruption. His claim had endured injury, delay, deception, and scrutiny without distortion. In Egyptian thought, this endurance mattered more than any single triumph. Authority that survived pressure without becoming chaotic demonstrated fitness to govern. The Eniad's judgment recognized Horus as the rightful ruler of the living world. This affirmation restored the line interrupted by Osiris's murder and re-established lawful succession. Kingship returned to its proper axis, aligning divine order with human governance once more. Importantly, this verdict did not erase conflict from memory. Egyptian mythology does not permit such erasure. Instead, it integrates conflict into structure. The gods acknowledged that disruption had occurred and that its consequences would persist. Restoration did not mean forgetting. It meant repositioning. In this repositioning, Seth was neither destroyed nor expelled from the cosmic order. His role was redefined. Seth remained a necessary force associated with storms, deserts, and foreign lands. These domains were dangerous, but they were also essential. Chaos, in Egyptian thought, was not evil. It was unmanaged chaos that threatened existence. The verdict placed Seth at the margins rather than the center. He would guard boundaries, confront external threats, and embody disruption without ruling the core of order. This distinction mattered deeply. By acknowledging Seth's necessity while limiting his authority, the Eniad preserved balance without surrendering legitimacy. Horus's response to this outcome reinforced his suitability. He did not demand Seth's destruction or humiliation. He accepted the structure as affirmed, recognizing that stability depended on containment rather than elimination. This acceptance reflected a mature understanding of governance. The verdict also clarified the role of Osiris, whose authority from the Duat remained intact. Osiris continued to rule the realm of the dead, overseeing judgment and renewal beyond life. This arrangement completed the triadic structure of Egyptian cosmology. Horus ruled the living, Osiris ruled the dead, and Seth guarded the thresholds where order met chaos. This structure resolved the crisis without simplifying it. Each force retained purpose. None dominated beyond its proper scope. The cosmos regained coherence not through conquest, but through differentiation. The final verdict did not unfold as a public coronation. Egyptian mythology resists spectacle at moments of deepest significance. Instead, the decision manifested through alignment. Rituals adjusted, roles clarified, authority became evident through function rather than proclamation. Horus's kingship began not with celebration, but with responsibility. His task was immediate and ongoing, to maintain Maat through ritual, justice, and restraint. Kingship was not a reward for past endurance. It was a commitment to future labor. This framing influenced how Egyptians understood leadership. A ruler was not elevated above obligation. He was bound to it. Horus's story emphasized that authority increased responsibility rather than privilege. The verdict also reinforced the value of process. The Eniad's prolonged deliberation was not a failure of decisiveness. It was a demonstration of care. Egyptian culture valued decisions that endured over decisions that impressed. The length of the process validated the stability of the outcome. For Seth, the verdict required adjustment. His strength remained respected, but it no longer defined kingship. This repositioning reflected a key Egyptian insight. Power without legitimacy destabilizes the system it seeks to defend. By limiting Seth's authority, the gods preserved his function without allowing it to dominate. The verdict also resolved a deeper moral tension. Seth's earlier deceptions and aggression had undermined trust. The Eniad did not ignore these actions. They informed the decision. Authority gained through deception could not sustain order. This principle resonated through Egyptian legal and ethical thought. Horus's conduct during the verdict remained consistent with his earlier restraint. He did not exploit Seth's loss of central authority. He accepted governance within the framework affirmed by the gods. This acceptance further distinguished him as a steward rather than a conqueror. The world responded to this realignment subtly. Egyptian mythology describes order returning not as dramatic transformation, but as easing. Ritual coherence strengthened, anxiety receded, the cosmos resumed its expected rhythms. The Nile's cycles continued, the seasons aligned, justice regained clarity. These signs mattered. Egyptian thought evaluated kingship through effects rather than declarations. A ruler's legitimacy was measured by the world's response. The final verdict thus completed the long process initiated by Osiris's murder. It restored lawful succession without denying the reality of disruption. It integrated chaos rather than pretending it could be erased. It affirmed continuity across life and death. This resolution also provided a template for future crises. Egypt understood that order could be broken and restored without annihilation. The story of Horus demonstrated that patience, judgment, and alignment could repair even profound rupture. Human kingship absorbed this lesson directly. Pharaohs ruled as Horus not because they were flawless, but because they were charged with maintaining balance across imperfection. This expectation shaped governance for centuries. The verdict's emphasis on placement over punishment influenced Egyptian responses to internal and external threats. Rebellion was contained rather than indulged. Foreign lands were acknowledged rather than denied. Order remained flexible enough to endure. The Eniad's role as arbiter also reinforced the importance of institutions. Authority did not reside solely in individuals. It was upheld by councils, rituals, and precedent. This institutional grounding contributed to Egypt's remarkable political longevity. As Horus assumed full kingship, his identity shifted subtly. He was no longer primarily a claimant, he was a guarantor. His focus turned from proving legitimacy to sustaining it. This shift marked the true beginning of his rule. The final verdict did not close the story. It opened a new phase defined by enactment rather than contest. Horus's kingship would now be expressed daily through ritual observance, justice, and protection of order. The gods withdrew from active deliberation. Their task was complete. The system stood. In Egyptian thought, such endings are quiet by design. Stability does not announce itself loudly. It settles. The world had been fractured. It had endured delay, deception, and conflict. Now, it was whole enough to continue. Horus stood at the center, not as a hero crowned in victory, but as a ruler bound to balance. Chaos remained, death remained, but each had been placed. Set's redefinition, not erasure. With the final verdict established and Horus affirmed at the center of order, the narrative turns to what did not happen. Seth was not destroyed. He was not cast into oblivion, nor stripped of existence. This absence of annihilation is not a narrative oversight. It is one of the most deliberate and revealing choices in Egyptian thought. and it explains why the restored order could endure rather than fracture again. Egyptian cosmology never imagined a universe free from disruption. Storms still broke across deserts, borders still faced threat, sudden illness and loss still occurred. What Egypt resisted was unmanaged chaos, disruption without boundary, force without placement. The resolution of the Horus-Seth conflict therefore required redefinition rather than erasure. Seth's role was reframed with care. He was assigned to the margins of the cosmos, where his nature made sense. He became guardian of the desert, the foreign, the storm, and the threshold. These were dangerous domains, but they were also necessary. They defined the limits of Egypt itself. Without boundaries, there could be no center. Without edges, order had no shape. This repositioning transformed Seth from a destabilizing ruler into a stabilizing counterforce. He no longer competed with Horus for kingship. Instead, he defended the structure Horus maintained. This arrangement reflected a mature understanding of power. Not all strength belongs at the center. Some strength exists to protect the perimeter. The gods understood that eliminating Seth would not eliminate chaos. It would remove a mechanism for containing it. Egyptian mythology consistently avoids solutions that deny reality. Chaos existed. It had to be managed, not denied. By redefining Seth's function, the Eniad preserved a tool for that management. This decision also addressed the moral dimension of Seth's actions. His murder of Osiris and subsequent deceptions were not excused. They informed the judgment. But punishment took the form of limitation rather than destruction. Seth lost central authority because his methods undermined trust. He did not lose existence because his force remained necessary. For Horus, accepting this outcome was a critical test of kingship. He did not demand Seth's elimination. He accepted a system that balanced competing forces without allowing any single one to dominate. This acceptance demonstrated his readiness to govern a complex world rather than an idealized one. The redefinition of Seth clarified the nature of justice in Egyptian thought. Justice was not vengeance, it was alignment. A wrong disrupted order, justice restored it. Destroying Seth would have introduced a new imbalance. Limiting his role restored proportion. This approach influenced how Egyptians understood punishment more broadly. Penalties aimed to restore harmony rather than inflict suffering for its own sake. Courts sought balance. Kings sought stability. The mythic treatment of Seth provided precedent. The repositioning also stabilized the relationship between the divine and human worlds. Human societies faced their own forms of disruption, crime, dissent, foreign threat. The Egyptian model suggested that such forces could be managed through structure rather than eradication. Total suppression risked brittleness. Managed containment allowed resilience. Seth's continued presence also reinforced the limits of kingship. Horus ruled the center, but he did not rule everything. There were domains beyond cultivation, beyond law, beyond ritual regularity. Acknowledging these limits prevented overreach. A ruler who claimed total control invited catastrophe. This insight shaped Egyptian attitudes toward foreign lands. The desert was dangerous, but it was not cursed. Foreign peoples were unpredictable, but they were not unreal. Egypt defined itself through contrast rather than denial. Seth's guardianship of the margins provided mythic grounding for this worldview. Ritually, Seth's redefinition appeared in temple practices and iconography. He was not universally vilified. In some contexts, he was invoked for protection against external threats. His strength remained respected, but it was no longer equated with rightful rule. This nuanced treatment prevented moral simplification. Egyptian mythology resisted the idea of pure evil. Forces were judged by placement rather than essence. Seth's essence was disruptive. Placed correctly, disruption served order. Placed at the center, it destroyed it. The redefinition also preserved continuity with the past. Seth had always been part of the pantheon. Erasing him would have created a rupture. Egypt valued continuity across generations, gods, and rituals. Repositioning allowed the system to evolve without breaking. Osiris's continued role in the Duat reinforced this balance. He governed judgment and renewal after death. Horus governed life and order. Seth governed thresholds and defense. Each domain was distinct. Overlap was minimized. balance was maintained. This structure also reflected Egyptian spatial imagination. The cultivated land along the Nile represented order. The desert represented danger. The river itself represented transition. Gods were assigned accordingly. Seth's domain made sense within this geography. Horus's acceptance of Seth's role demonstrated political maturity. He did not seek to rewrite the cosmos to eliminate challenge. He governed within its realities. This realism distinguished Egyptian kingship from models that sought total domination. The redefinition also stabilized divine politics. The Eniad could withdraw from active arbitration because roles were clear. Conflict no longer required constant supervision. The system could regulate itself. This outcome mattered for longevity. Systems that require constant intervention collapse. Systems that embed balance endure. Egypt's mythic resolution prioritized the latter. Human kings mirrored this structure. Pharaohs ruled the center. Officials managed administration. Military forces guarded borders. Each role had limits. Overlap was controlled. This division of function reduced internal conflict. The redefinition of Seth thus had practical consequences. It informed statecraft, military organization, and legal theory. It offered a model for integrating force without allowing it to dominate civil life. Culturally, the story reassured Egyptians that disorder had a place. Life would include disruption. Storms would come. Foreign powers would threaten. These realities did not signal cosmic failure. They signaled the ongoing work of balance. This reassurance mattered psychologically. It reduced fear of the unknown. Chaos was not an enemy lurking beyond comprehension. It was a force with boundaries and function. The myth also cautioned rulers against hubris. Attempting to eliminate chaos entirely would destabilize order. Wise governance acknowledged limits and prepared for disruption rather than denying it. Seth's redefinition, therefore, completed the restoration initiated by Horus's ascension. Order was not brittle, it was flexible. It could absorb strain without collapsing. The narrative emphasizes that this outcome required restraint from all parties. The gods resisted absolutism. Horus resisted vengeance. Seth, constrained, continued to serve without ruling. This balance allowed the cosmos to move forward without lingering grievance. No force was erased, no memory was denied. The system held. In Egyptian thought, such endings were ideal. They preserved continuity while accommodating reality. They restored order without demanding perfection. As the story progresses, Seth's presence at the margins will continue to matter. He will guard the sun god's journey through the night. He will confront external threats. His strength will remain visible, but his authority will remain limited. Horus's kingship, defined against this backdrop, gains depth. He rules not because chaos is gone, but because it is contained. His authority is meaningful precisely because it operates within constraint. The redefinition of Seth stands as one of the most enduring insights of Egyptian mythology. It recognizes that power must be placed correctly to be constructive. Misplaced power destroys, properly placed power protects. This lesson resonated across centuries of Egyptian history. It shaped governance, ritual, and worldview. It allowed a civilization to endure extraordinary spans of time without collapsing under its own rigidity. The cosmos now functioned with clarity. Order had a center. Chaos had boundaries. Death had governance. Life had stewardship. The world did not become safe. It became balanced. Horus, as living kingship, with the roles of the gods clarified and the balance of the cosmos restored, Horus's identity underwent a final and lasting transformation. He was no longer primarily a claimant shaped by trial, nor simply a divine victor affirmed by judgment. He became something more enduring and more practical, the living principle of kingship itself. In Egyptian thought, this shift mattered more than any single decision or confrontation. It defined how authority would be understood, enacted, and preserved across generations. Horus, as living kingship, did not exist only in myth, he existed in practice. From this point forward, every human ruler of Egypt would be understood not merely as chosen by Horus, but as Horus. This was not metaphor or poetic language. It was a structural belief embedded into titles, rituals, law, and daily governance. The king was Horus made present in the world of the living. This concept resolved a central challenge faced by early states: how to sustain authority beyond the lifespan of any one ruler. Egypt's solution was neither purely hereditary nor purely elective. It was cosmic. Kingship itself was eternal, embodied temporarily by individuals who stepped into a role larger than themselves. Horus provided the continuity that individual lives could not. The king's accession to the throne was therefore not a personal achievement, it was a ritual transformation. The moment of coronation marked the moment when Horus took up residence in a human body. This belief carried profound implications. The king's actions were no longer judged solely as personal choices, they were evaluated as expressions of cosmic order. This expectation imposed restraint. A ruler could not behave impulsively without risking more than political backlash. He risked cosmic imbalance. Egyptian texts consistently emphasize calmness, justice, and ritual precision in royal behavior. These were not aesthetic preferences, they were functional requirements for maintaining Ma'at. Horus's own narrative reinforced these qualities. He had not seized power through aggression, he had endured, waited, and aligned. This made him an ideal template for living kingship. The king was expected to embody stability rather than spectacle, continuity rather than novelty. This embodiment extended into language. Royal titulary included a Horus name, explicitly linking the king's identity to the god. In inscriptions, the king did not speak merely as an individual. He spoke as Horus, acting within the world. This linguistic practice reinforced the fusion of divine and human authority. The king's physical presence mattered as well. His body was believed to carry cosmic significance. Health, posture, and composure were not private matters. They were indicators of the state of order itself. Illness or disorder in the king could signal imbalance in the world. This belief intensified the emphasis on ritual care and protection of the royal body. Horus's association with the falcon reinforced this oversight function. The falcon's high vantage point symbolized clarity of perception. A king was expected to see broadly, to understand patterns rather than react to isolated events. This expectation shaped administrative practice. Decisions were meant to reflect long-term balance rather than short-term advantage. This perspective influenced how justice was administered. Courts were expected to restore balance rather than impose punishment for its own sake. Judges acted as extensions of royal authority, which itself was an extension of Horus. The goal was alignment with Ma'at, not retribution. Horus, as living kingship, also structured military power. The king commanded armies, but warfare was framed as defense of order rather than conquest for its own sake. Campaigns were justified as restoring balance at the borders, rather than expanding power indefinitely. This framing mirrored Horus's acceptance of Seth's continued role at the margins. Even monumental building projects reflected this philosophy. Temples, statues, and monuments were constructed to endure, emphasizing permanence over innovation. Architecture aligned with celestial movements, reinforcing the connection between kingship and cosmic order. The king built not to glorify himself, but to maintain alignment between heaven and earth. This emphasis on continuity produced remarkable stability. While dynasties changed, the structure of kingship remained recognizable for millennia. Horus's identity as living kingship provided a stable core around which political change could occur without systemic collapse. Education of future kings reflected this orientation. Princes were trained not only in military skill, but in ritual knowledge, administration, and moral conduct. They learned to perform ceremonies precisely, to respect precedent, and to consult advisors. This preparation mirrored Horus's own long period of guidance and trial. The presence of priests within governance reinforced this structure. Priests did not rule in place of the king, but they safeguarded ritual continuity. Their role mirrored the Eniad's role among the gods, advising, interpreting, and maintaining order through procedure rather than force. This institutional balance prevented authority from concentrating dangerously in one place. Horus's kingship also shaped economic life. Agricultural cycles were tied to ritual calendars. The king's role in maintaining cosmic order was believed to influence the Nile's flooding. While modern understanding separates governance from hydrology, Egyptian thought integrated them. The king's alignment with Horus reassured communities facing environmental uncertainty. This integration extended into daily life. Ordinary Egyptians encountered Horus not only in temples, but in administrative documents, festivals, and legal proceedings. The king's seal carried Horus's authority. The law carried Horus's order. Myth and governance were inseparable. Importantly, this structure allowed for criticism without immediate rebellion. A king who failed to uphold Maat could be described as failing Horus's standard. This critique targeted conduct rather than the institution itself. Kingship remained intact even when individual kings fell short. This distinction contributed to Egypt's resilience. Political upheaval did not necessarily threaten cosmic collapse. The office of Horus endured beyond individual failure. New rulers could step into the role and restore alignment through ritual and reform. Foreign rulers who sought legitimacy in Egypt understood this requirement. Conquerors adopted Horus imagery and titles to present themselves as continuers rather than disruptors. This adaptability allowed Egyptian culture to absorb change without losing identity. Horus, as living kingship, also shaped how Egyptians understood death. The king did not cease to matter when he died. He became Osiris, joining the realm of judgment and renewal. This transition completed the cycle. Horus in life, Osiris in death. Kingship spanned both realms, ensuring continuity across generations. This belief reinforced ethical constraints. A king would face judgment after death. Power exercised unjustly would have consequences beyond life. This expectation placed moral limits on authority, even when enforcement was imperfect. The fusion of Horus with human kingship also shaped art. Royal statues portrayed calm, idealized forms rather than individualized expression. This was not a lack of skill. It was intentional. The image represented the office, not the person. Timelessness mattered more than realism. Literature reinforced these themes. Instructional texts emphasized humility, justice, and restraint. They warned against arrogance and impulsiveness. These warnings echoed Horus's narrative, reminding rulers that alignment sustained authority. Horus's kingship also structured the relationship between center and periphery. The king governed the cultivated land along the Nile, while recognizing the desert as a realm of danger and defense. This spatial understanding mirrored the cosmic placement of Seth. Order had a center, chaos had edges. This model allowed Egypt to interact with a complex world without seeking total domination. Trade, diplomacy, and limited warfare could coexist within a framework that prioritized balance. The enduring power of Horus as living kingship lay in its flexibility. It did not require rulers to be heroic conquerors. It required them to be steady custodians. This lowered the threshold for effective governance, while raising the standard for legitimacy. Over centuries, this model proved remarkably durable. Egypt experienced periods of fragmentation, foreign rule, and internal conflict. Yet the concept of kingship as Horus persisted. It provided a shared language for authority even in times of change. This persistence speaks to the strength of the original resolution between Horus and Seth. By integrating chaos rather than denying it, Egyptian mythology created a governance model capable of absorbing disruption without collapse. Horus, as living kingship, thus represents the culmination of his narrative. He is no longer simply a god with a story. He is a structure through which society understands itself. His endurance reflects not triumph, but balance, achieved through restraint. As the narrative moves forward, this living kingship will shape temples, rituals, and daily governance. Horus's presence will be felt not through dramatic intervention, but through continuity maintained over time. The world remains imperfect, storms still come, death still occurs, but order persists because it is embodied, renewed, and carried forward. In this way, Horus fulfills his role not by ending conflict forever, but by making life sustainable within it. His kingship does not promise safety, it promises balance, and for Egypt, that promise was enough. Temples, iconography, and worship. With Horus established as living kingship, the abstract principles of cosmic order required tangible form. Egyptian culture did not allow ideas to remain unembodied. Belief became visible through architecture, art, and daily ritual. In this way, Horus's authority moved from judgment and governance into stone, pigment, gesture, and habit. What had been affirmed among the gods now needed to be sustained among people. Temples became the primary instruments of this translation. They were not conceived as gathering places for communal worship in the later sense, but as carefully regulated environments where cosmic maintenance occurred. Each temple functioned as a microcosm of the universe, ordered precisely to reflect the structure Horus now governed. Orientation mattered, measurements mattered. Even the sequence of rooms mirrored the movement from chaos at the margins toward order at the center. Within these spaces, Horus appeared not as a distant mythic figure, but as a present authority. His images adorned walls, columns, and ritual objects. The falcon form, with its forward gaze and controlled power, dominated royal iconography. It communicated oversight rather than aggression. This distinction mattered. The image of Horus reassured stability rather than incited fear. Egyptian iconography was never decorative alone. Each element carried function. The placement of Horus's image at temple entrances signaled protection. Within sanctuaries, it affirmed continuity between the human and divine realms. In reliefs, Horus often appeared crowning the king, visually reinforcing the belief that human rule derived from divine order. This visual language extended beyond temples into statecraft. Seals, standards, and official inscriptions bore Horus's symbols. Documents did not merely record decisions, they enacted authority. The presence of Horus's imagery transformed administrative acts into ritual affirmations of order. Worship practices reinforced this integration. Daily rituals performed by priests were not acts of devotion in a personal sense, they were acts of maintenance. Food offerings, libations, and hymns were believed to sustain the gods, who in turn sustained the cosmos. Horus's role within this cycle was central. As living kingship, he connected ritual continuity with political stability. The king's participation in these rituals was essential. He did not delegate all responsibility to priests. Even when absent physically, his presence was invoked. The belief that Horus ruled through the king meant that ritual performed in the king's name carried cosmic weight. This reinforced the inseparability of governance and worship. Iconography also extended into funerary contexts. Amulets bearing Horus's eye were placed with the dead, symbolizing protection and restoration. This practice reflected the belief that the principles governing life extended into death. The restored eye promised wholeness beyond disruption, aligning personal hope with cosmic order. These symbols were not restricted to elites. Ordinary Egyptians encountered Horus's imagery in household objects, local shrines, and communal festivals. This accessibility mattered. The stability Horus represented was not reserved for kings alone. It permeated daily life, offering reassurance amid uncertainty. Festivals played a particularly important role. Public celebrations reenacted mythic events, reinforcing communal memory. Processions, music, and ritual drama made abstract principles tangible. Horus's triumphs were not celebrated as violent victories, but as restorations of balance. This framing shaped public understanding of authority. Temple economies also reflected Horus's influence. Temples were centers of redistribution, storage, and labor organization. Their orderly functioning mirrored cosmic order. Grain collected, recorded, and redistributed according to ritual calendars reinforced the connection between agricultural stability and divine governance. Artistic conventions supported this worldview. Figures were depicted in standardized poses, emphasizing continuity rather than individual expression. This was not a limitation of creativity, but a deliberate choice. Timelessness conveyed stability. Horus's presence within these images anchored them to enduring principles rather than fleeting moments. The consistency of iconography across centuries underscores the durability of Horus's role. While styles evolved subtly, core symbols remained recognizable. This continuity allowed Egyptians to perceive themselves as participants in an unbroken tradition, even as dynasties changed. Regional variations existed, but they rarely contradicted central principles. Local forms of Horus merged with regional deities, reflecting flexibility within structure. This adaptability prevented fragmentation. Diverse expressions remained aligned with a shared cosmic framework. Ritual texts further reinforced Horus's authority. Hymns praised his vigilance. Prayers invoked his protection. Legal formulas referenced his oversight. Language itself became an instrument of order, echoing the belief that words shaped reality. The integration of Horus into daily worship also influenced moral expectations. Individuals were encouraged to act justly, not only out of fear of punishment, but out of alignment with cosmic order. Horus's watchful presence implied accountability without constant surveillance. Education reinforced these values. Scribes learned formulas that linked law, ritual, and kingship. Instructional texts emphasized restraint, fairness, and adherence to tradition. These teachings echoed Horus's narrative, embedding mythic lessons into practical guidance. Foreign interactions further demonstrate the power of this system. When Egypt encountered external cultures, Horus's imagery often appeared in diplomatic contexts. Treaties invoked divine order. Conquests were framed as restorations rather than expansions. This language legitimized authority without requiring continuous force. Temples also functioned as repositories of memory. Reliefs recorded historical events alongside mythic scenes, collapsing time into continuity. Horus's presence in these records suggested that contemporary events unfolded within a timeless framework. This perception stabilized identity amid change. The durability of Horus's cult did not depend on emotional fervor. It depended on repetition. Daily rituals, seasonal festivals, and generational transmission sustained belief quietly. Egyptian religion favored persistence over intensity. This persistence explains why Horus's worship endured even during periods of political weakness. When central authority faltered, temples continued their routines. The structure held, waiting for alignment to be restored. The emphasis on restoration rather than rupture allowed Egyptian society to recover from crisis without reinventing itself. Horus's imagery reassured continuity even when leadership changed. The system did not collapse because its foundations were not tied to individual charisma. The relationship between temple and state illustrates this resilience. While power dynamics shifted over time, the symbolic framework remained stable. Horus's authority anchored governance beyond transient circumstances. This anchoring extended into personal piety. Individuals carried amulets, recited prayers, and participated in festivals not to challenge authority, but to align with it. Horus's protection was sought in illness, travel, and uncertainty. The god's presence was practical as well as symbolic. The Eye of Horus, in particular, exemplified this integration. Its use in medicine, measurement, and protection reflected the belief that restoration was possible at every scale. Just as Horus's eye had been healed, so too could individuals recover balance. This symbolism reinforced optimism, tempered by realism. Injury occurred, loss occurred, restoration required effort. Horus's narrative provided a framework for enduring hardship without despair. As centuries passed, temples dedicated to Horus became landmarks of continuity. Their inscriptions accumulated layers of history, yet their core symbolism remained intact. Pilgrims encountered familiar images across generations, reinforcing shared identity. The endurance of these structures speaks to the success of the mythic resolution that placed Horus at the center. By embedding kingship into worship and art, Egyptian culture ensured that authority was not abstract or distant. It was present, visible, and maintained through daily practice. This presence did not require constant affirmation, it required maintenance. The quiet regularity of ritual sustained order more effectively than dramatic proclamation. In this way, temples, iconography, and worship completed the transformation of Horus from mythic figure to lived reality. His authority was no longer confined to narrative, it structured time, space, and behavior. As the story continues, Horus's image will evolve, adapt, and be reinterpreted, but its core function will remain unchanged, to embody continuity, to reassure balance, and to anchor life within an ordered cosmos. The stone walls, painted reliefs, and spoken formulas did not merely commemorate Horus, they enacted him. Through them, the god remained present, not as distant legend, but as ongoing structure. The falcon's gaze endured, changes across dynasties. As centuries passed and dynasties rose and fell, the figure of Horus did not remain fixed in outward expression. What endured was not a single artistic style or ritual formula, but a core function, Horus as the stabilizing principle of kingship. Egyptian civilization proved remarkably capable of preserving this function while allowing its forms to shift in response to political, economic, and cultural change. This adaptability is one of the clearest reasons Horus remained central for so long. Egyptian culture did not demand rigidity from its symbols. It demanded continuity of purpose. As long as Horus continued to represent lawful succession, balance, and living authority, his depiction and emphasis could evolve without threatening the system. In the earliest dynastic periods, Horus appeared primarily as a falcon or falcon-headed figure, closely associated with royal names and territorial unification. This imagery emphasized vigilance and dominance from above. The early kings, consolidating power along the Nile, found this symbolism effective. It communicated oversight, unity, and control without overt violence. As the state matured, Horus's role became more explicitly institutional. Kingship was no longer experimental, it was established. Accordingly, Horus's imagery shifted subtly toward reassurance rather than assertion. Reliefs emphasized calm posture, formal symmetry, and ritual continuity. The god's presence signaled that the system was functioning as intended. During periods of strong central authority, Horus was portrayed as stable and unchallenged. His association with the king was clear and confident. Ritual texts from these eras emphasize maintenance rather than conflict. The mythic struggle with Seth receded into background memory, replaced by an emphasis on order already achieved. In contrast, during periods of fragmentation or transition, Horus's imagery and ritual prominence intensified. When central authority weakened, Egyptians turned more explicitly to the symbols that promised restoration. Horus re-emerged, not as a given, but as a goal. His narrative of endurance through disruption regained relevance. This pattern can be observed across multiple dynastic transitions. When power shifted between families or regions, new rulers emphasized their Horus identity to assert legitimacy. They did not invent new symbols. They reaffirmed old ones. This reliance on continuity rather than innovation stabilized transitions that might otherwise have fractured the state. The flexibility of Horus's symbolism also allowed regional variation without fragmentation. Local cults emphasized aspects of Horus that resonated with their environment: protection of borders, oversight of agriculture, or guardianship of specific sites. These variations did not undermine central authority, they localized it. This localization mattered in a geographically diverse land. The Nile Valley was not uniform. Conditions varied between Upper and Lower Egypt, between cultivated land and desert edge. Horus's capacity to adapt symbolically allowed kingship to remain relevant across these differences. Changes in artistic style across dynasties further illustrate this adaptability. Proportions shifted, materials varied, yet Horus's essential features remained recognizable. The falcon's gaze, the controlled stance, and the association with royal authority persisted. Recognition mattered more than realism. Textual traditions evolved similarly. Early inscriptions were concise and declarative. Later texts grew more elaborate, incorporating theological reflection and moral instruction. Horus's role expanded from guarantor of kingship to exemplar of just rule. This expansion mirrored the increasing complexity of Egyptian administration. As bureaucracy grew, so did the need for moral framing. Horus's narrative provided it. Officials and scribes invoked Ma'at under Horus's authority to justify legal decisions and administrative practices. The god's presence extended beyond the throne into the machinery of governance. Periods of foreign influence tested this system. When external powers entered Egypt, they encountered not just a political structure, but a cosmological one. Successful rulers learned quickly that legitimacy required alignment with Horus. Those who ignored this principle faced resistance. Foreign dynasties that adopted Horus imagery found smoother integration. They presented themselves not as disruptors, but as continuers of order. This strategy did not erase tension, but it reduced it. Horus's symbolism provided a bridge between old and new authority. This capacity for absorption without erasure was one of Egypt's defining strengths. Horus did not represent ethnic identity or personal lineage alone. He represented function. Anyone who fulfilled that function could, in principle, embody him. Religious texts from later periods reflect increasing emphasis on ethical conduct. Horus was associated not only with power, but with justice. This shift responded to social complexity. As inequality and administrative distance grew, moral reassurance became more important. Horus's endurance through these changes demonstrates a key feature of Egyptian thought. Symbols survived by serving practical needs. Horus remained relevant because he continued to answer fundamental questions about authority, continuity, and balance. Even when artistic conventions changed dramatically, Horus's presence remained intelligible. His imagery acted as a stabilizing reference point amid stylistic innovation. This continuity allowed Egyptians to perceive change without experiencing rupture. The relationship between Horus and Seth also evolved in emphasis. Early narratives highlighted conflict. Later periods emphasized balance. Seth's role as guardian of the margins became more prominent, reinforcing the idea that chaos was contained rather than defeated. This shift reflected lived experience. Egypt increasingly encountered complex external pressures, trade, diplomacy, and warfare. Absolute narratives of triumph gave way to more nuanced understandings of coexistence. Horus's kingship adapted accordingly. Horus also absorbed qualities from other deities over time. This syncretism did not dilute his identity, it expanded it. Egyptian religion often merged gods with overlapping functions. Horus's role as living kingship allowed him to incorporate attributes that reinforced governance. This process helped maintain relevance across generations. Horus was not frozen in an archaic form, he evolved while retaining purpose. This balance between tradition and adaptation sustained long-term coherence. Educational texts from later dynasties reflect this synthesis. They present Horus not as a distant god, but as a model for leadership. Instructional literature emphasized humility, restraint, and attentiveness, qualities drawn directly from Horus's narrative. The persistence of these teachings across centuries demonstrates their perceived effectiveness. Egyptian society continued to find value in a model of authority that prioritized balance over domination. Material culture also reflects these changes. Amulets, household objects, and personal seals featuring Horus became more widespread. This diffusion suggests that Horus's protective and restorative aspects resonated beyond elite contexts. The Eye of Horus, in particular, gained prominence as a symbol of healing and completeness. Its use in daily life reinforced the belief that restoration was always possible, even amid disruption. This belief aligned with the broader narrative of kingship restored after fracture. The adaptability of Horus's symbolism also allowed for reinterpretation during periods of religious reform. New emphases did not require abandonment of Horus. They required reframing. This flexibility prevented religious schism. As dynasties changed, the story of Horus remained available as a reference point. It provided language for legitimacy, patience, and restoration. It allowed rulers to situate themselves within a long continuum rather than standing alone. This continuity mattered psychologically. It reassured populations facing uncertainty that change did not equal collapse. Horus's presence suggested that order could be restored even after disruption. The durability of this belief system did not depend on uniformity. It depended on coherence. Horus remained coherent because his core function, maintaining balance through legitimate authority, did not change. When Egypt faced internal division, Horus was invoked as unifier. When it faced external threat, he was invoked as protector. When it faced moral uncertainty, he was invoked as judge. This versatility did not dilute his meaning. It confirmed it. The ability of a single figure to serve multiple needs across time speaks to the sophistication of Egyptian symbolic thought. Horus was not a simplistic emblem. He was a structural principle capable of addressing varied circumstances. This principle allowed Egyptian civilization to endure periods that might have fractured less cohesive systems. Horus's kingship did not eliminate conflict. It provided a framework for navigating it. As the narrative approaches later reinterpretations, this adaptability becomes even more evident. Horus's image will cross cultural boundaries, encountering new philosophical contexts, yet his core function will remain recognizable. The changes across dynasties did not weaken Horus. They demonstrated his strength, a symbol that cannot adapt breaks. Horus bent without breaking. Through shifting styles, political upheaval, and cultural exchange, the falcon remained, sometimes prominent, sometimes understated, but always present. This endurance was not accidental. It was the result of a narrative that prioritized balance, legitimacy, and restoration values that remained relevant regardless of circumstance. As Egypt continued through centuries of transformation, Horus continued to serve as the living measure of kingship, not frozen in the past, but carried forward into each new present. The system held because its center was flexible without becoming unstable. Horus embodied that balance. The story moves now toward broader horizons, where Egypt's symbols will encounter new worlds. But before that encounter, it is essential to recognize what has already occurred. A god shaped by conflict became a principle shaped by time. Horus did not survive change by resisting it. He survived by giving it structure. Greek and Roman reinterpretations. When Egypt entered the orbit of Greek and later Roman power, the figure of Horus did not disappear. Instead, he underwent another transformation, one that tested the flexibility of Egyptian symbolism under foreign rule. This phase did not erase the past. It layered new interpretations onto an ancient framework, revealing how deeply Horus had been embedded not only in religion, but in the logic of governance itself. Foreign rule posed a fundamental challenge. Authority now arrived from outside Egypt's traditional lineage system. Kings and emperors could not plausibly claim descent from earlier pharaohs. Yet Egypt's political and religious structures still required alignment with cosmic order. The question was not whether Horus would survive, but how he would be understood. The arrival of Greek power under Alexander the Great marked the beginning of this transition. Alexander did not attempt to dismantle Egyptian religious structures. Instead, he sought legitimacy within them. His visit to the oracle at Siwa signaled a deliberate effort to position himself within Egypt's cosmological framework. While not explicitly equated with Horus in the earliest phase, his actions reflected awareness that authority in Egypt required more than military success. After Alexander's death, Egypt came under the control of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek ruling family that faced a complex legitimacy problem. They governed a deeply traditional society with a foreign elite. Their solution was not replacement, but synthesis. Egyptian religious structures were preserved, and Horus remained central to the concept of kingship. The Ptolemies adopted pharaonic titles and participated in traditional rituals. They presented themselves as continuers rather than disruptors. Horus imagery continued to appear in temple reliefs, inscriptions, and ceremonial contexts. This continuity reassured the population that cosmic order remained intact even as the ruling class changed. At the same time, Horus began to absorb Hellenistic philosophical interpretations. Greek thinkers tended to conceptualize gods as abstract principles rather than localized forces. Horus's role as living kingship lent itself to reinterpretation as a symbol of rational order and lawful authority. This reframing did not contradict Egyptian belief. It translated it. Syncretism accelerated during this period. Horus was increasingly associated with solar imagery and universal sovereignty, qualities that resonated with Greek ideas of cosmic reason. These associations broadened his appeal without displacing his core function. He remained the guarantor of order, now expressed through multiple cultural lenses. The Roman conquest introduced another layer of reinterpretation. Roman rulers, like the Greeks before them, faced the challenge of governing Egypt without undermining its religious foundations. Their approach followed a familiar pattern: adopt, adapt, and integrate. Roman emperors did not present themselves as Horus in the same intimate way Egyptian pharaohs had, but they allowed Horus's imagery and rituals to continue. Temples remained active, priestly institutions persisted. The symbolism of kingship endured even as the political reality shifted. This tolerance was pragmatic. Egypt's agricultural productivity was vital to the Roman Empire. Stability mattered. Disrupting religious structures risked unrest. Horus's continued presence provided continuity, anchoring daily life in familiar rhythms. Roman ideology also found points of contact with Horus's symbolism. Roman governance emphasized order, law, and continuity across generations, values that aligned naturally with Horus's role. While Romans did not fully adopt Egyptian cosmology, they respected its capacity to sustain social coherence. Art from the Roman period illustrates this layered identity. Horus appears alongside Roman motifs, sometimes rendered in styles that blend Egyptian formality with Greco-Roman naturalism. These images do not suggest confusion, they suggest accommodation. The god remained recognizable even as his visual language evolved. Texts from this period reveal similar blending. Egyptian religious language absorbed Greek philosophical terms. Horus's kingship was sometimes framed in terms of universal sovereignty rather than local lineage. This shift reflected the empire's scale. Authority now spanned diverse cultures, and symbols had to speak across boundaries. Importantly, Horus's relationship with Seth continued to be understood through balance rather than annihilation. Roman thought, which often framed power in terms of dominance, encountered a different model in Egyptian cosmology. The idea that chaos could be contained rather than eliminated offered a nuanced perspective on governance. This perspective may have contributed to Roman tolerance of Egyptian religious practice. The system did not demand exclusivity, it allowed multiple layers of meaning to coexist. Horus did not require exclusive devotion to function, he required alignment. For Egyptian priests and intellectuals, this period demanded careful negotiation. They preserved core rituals while translating their significance for new audiences. Horus's narrative proved adaptable. It could be explained in terms of moral order, natural law, or divine kingship without losing coherence. The spread of mystery religions during the Roman period further expanded Horus's symbolic reach. Elements of Egyptian belief, including concepts of death, renewal, and cosmic judgment, entered broader Mediterranean religious discourse. While Horus was not always named directly, his functions influenced these exchanges. The figure of the divine child, protected and destined to restore order, resonated across cultures. This resonance did not erase Horus's Egyptian identity, it demonstrated the universality of the themes he embodied. As Christianity began to emerge and spread, Egyptian religious symbols faced new challenges. Yet even here, Horus's imagery left traces. The motif of the divine child and protective mother echoed in later iconography. These parallels did not represent direct borrowing alone, they reflected shared symbolic language shaped by centuries of cultural interaction. Horus's persistence through these transitions underscores a key insight. Symbols rooted in governance endured differently than symbols rooted solely in belief. Horus was not just a god to be worshipped, he was a framework for understanding authority, continuity, and restoration. Such frameworks adapt because they address persistent human concerns. Even as formal worship of Horus declined in later periods, his influence did not vanish abruptly. Administrative practices, ethical ideals, and artistic conventions retained traces of his logic. The concept of legitimate authority grounded in continuity outlasted specific rituals. The Roman period also highlighted the limits of reinterpretation. While Horus could be translated, he could not be fully absorbed into Roman theology without loss. His meaning depended on a worldview that integrated land, ritual, and kingship. Outside that context, he became a symbol rather than a structure. This distinction explains why Horus's most enduring legacy remained strongest in Egypt itself. There, the full system ritual, geography, memory continued to support his function. Elsewhere, elements were adopted, adapted, or echoed, but not fully replicated. As Roman rule eventually gave way to new political and religious realities, the temples closed or transformed. Yet the logic Horus represented did not disappear entirely. Ideas of lawful succession, moral authority, and balance between order and disruption persisted in different forms. Horus's journey through Greek and Roman reinterpretation thus reveals both flexibility and limit. He could adapt to new languages and philosophies, but his deepest meaning required a system that valued continuity over conquest. This phase of the narrative demonstrates the strength of the original Egyptian resolution. Because Horus's kingship was defined by balance rather than domination, it could survive under foreign rule without constant resistance. It did not demand supremacy, it demanded placement. Foreign rulers who respected this placement governed more smoothly. Those who ignored it faced unrest. The lesson was practical as well as symbolic. As the ancient world moved toward new religious frameworks, Horus's role gradually receded from active worship. But his influence remained embedded in the cultural memory of authority. The idea that rulers must align with a moral order larger than themselves did not vanish. The falcon's gaze, once directed over the Nile, now lingered in philosophical discussions of law and legitimacy. Horus had become less visible, but not irrelevant. The story now approaches its conclusion. Horus has moved from divine conflict to living kingship, from temple ritual to cultural memory. His form has changed, but his function has endured. What remains is not a god frozen in antiquity, but a principle tested across time. That order must be restored through patience, legitimacy, and balance, not seized through force alone. This principle would outlast empires. By the time formal worship of Horus began to fade, his work was already complete in a deeper sense. He no longer needed temples filled with incense or priests reciting his names at dawn. The structure he had shaped, the understanding of authority as balance, legitimacy as continuity, and power as placement, had settled into the foundations of Egyptian thought and, through Egypt, into the wider human imagination. Horus's enduring legacy was not the memory of conflict, but the memory of resolution. His story did not teach that chaos could be defeated forever. It taught that chaos could be lived with, bounded, and redirected. This distinction is why the narrative remained relevant long after its mythic context receded. In Egyptian culture, order was never imagined as a final state. It was a process renewed daily. The sun rose each morning not because chaos had vanished, but because order was actively maintained. Horus embodied this maintenance. His kingship was not a dramatic intervention, but a steady presence that allowed life to continue predictably enough to flourish. This understanding shaped how Egyptians approached history itself. They did not record events primarily as progress or decline. They recorded them as restorations and disruptions, returns to balance or departures from it. Horus's narrative provided the lens through which such judgments were made. Even when Egypt ceased to be politically independent, this lens persisted. Authority continued to be evaluated in terms of legitimacy, restraint, and alignment with a larger moral order. Rulers were judged not only by success, but by whether their success felt stable. The legacy of Horus can be seen in this quiet standard. He established the idea that leadership must endure scrutiny over time. A ruler's true strength lay not in decisive moments alone, but in sustained coherence across years of pressure, uncertainty, and change. This idea did not require belief in Egyptian gods to remain meaningful. It translated easily into philosophy, law, and ethics. The notion that power must be constrained by legitimacy reappears wherever societies reflect seriously on governance. Horus's story also preserved the value of patience. His kingship was delayed, tested, and refined before it was confirmed. This narrative countered the impulse toward immediate resolution. It suggested that some problems required time to reveal their solutions. This lesson resonated far beyond Egypt. Cultures encountering Egyptian thought absorbed not just its imagery, but its caution. Authority imposed too quickly rarely lasted. Authority earned through endurance embedded itself more deeply. Horus's relationship with Seth contributed another enduring insight, that disruption is not inherently evil. Egyptian thought did not moralize chaos as corruption alone. It recognized its necessity at the margins. This recognition allowed for resilience rather than brittleness. Societies that attempt to eliminate all disorder often collapse under their own rigidity. Horus's model accepted imperfection and planned for it. This acceptance made stability sustainable rather than fragile. The integration of death into kingship through Osiris reinforced this long view. Leadership did not end with life. Responsibility extended beyond the individual. This belief encouraged continuity and humility. No ruler stood outside the system he governed. Even after belief in the Duat faded, the idea that leaders would be judged by history remained. Horus's legacy thus survived as a secular principle as much as a religious one. In art and memory, Horus gradually shifted from active god to symbolic presence. Yet symbols do not lose power when they lose ritual. They change how they operate. Horus became a measure rather than an object of worship. The falcon's gaze turned inward, becoming a metaphor for oversight, foresight, and clarity. These qualities continued to be associated with good governance long after temples fell silent. Horus's endurance also highlights the success of Egyptian civilization in articulating a stable model of authority early and refining it patiently. Few societies achieved such longevity without constant reinvention. Egypt endured because it embedded flexibility into its core. This flexibility did not mean absence of principle. It meant principled balance. Horus's kingship did not promise perfection. It promised repair. That promise remains compelling. Human societies continue to face disruption, contested authority, and uncertainty. The question Horus's story answers, how to restore order without denying complexity, has not disappeared. Horus did not offer a solution that depended on exceptional individuals alone. He offered a system that could function through ordinary maintenance. This practicality explains his lasting influence. The story also preserves a quiet humility. Horus did not rule because he was flawless. He ruled because he remained aligned. This distinction matters. It suggests that leadership is not about eliminating weakness, but about preventing weakness from becoming disorder. In this sense, Horus's legacy is less about power and more about responsibility. Authority, once accepted, becomes obligation. Order, once restored, requires care. As centuries passed and cultures changed, the explicit memory of Horus faded, but the pattern remained. Law, tradition, and moral authority continued to rely on the same principles: legitimacy, continuity, restraint, and balance. These principles do not announce themselves loudly. They operate quietly, like the steady rise of the Nile or the predictable arc of the sun. Horus belonged to this quiet work. His story ends not with triumph, but with settlement, not with conquest, but with structure restored. This ending reflects Egyptian wisdom. The goal was never to end struggle forever. It was to make life possible within it. As night deepens and attention softens, the image that remains is not of battle, but of steadiness. A falcon, poised, watchful, unhurried, a world functioning not because it is perfect, but because it is balanced. Horus does not promise that chaos will vanish. He promises that it can be lived with, bounded, and understood. That promise sustained a civilization for thousands of years, and it remains, quietly, one of humanity's oldest and most durable answers to the problem of power.